All right. We will begin the third of our sessions together under the rubric of the automation as ecology. The discussions in this third and fourth session will, as indicated, build on many of the themes that we set out with in the first two, particularly in the first one, as we sort of gave a bit of an overview and outline of the whole. And in this one, this question, which we had a very interesting discussion about, I think, at the end of the second session yesterday, about this expanded and expansive definition of automation in relationship to ecology will be sort of the first focus for our discussion this morning. One way to enter into this more directly might be through this notion that what automation does in a way is to automate autonomy itself. What automation automates in the particular model we're trying to sort of explore is the capacity for and the action of making a contingent decision within a larger relay system, such that in this automation, which becomes a repetition of the decision within this contingent relay, the decision doesn't need to be decided anymore. It's already been decided. And so even in the ability for there to be a reliably predicted that decision has been decided, aspects and components of that entire relay system become more durable. And as they become more durable, persistent, consistent, they become more predictable, and because of this, additional interest, actors, agencies might, let's say, their opportunity cost for participating in that relay is lowered, because the degree of uncertainty as to how that relay is going to operate and what's going to happen next is to a certain degree lessened by the fact that there is these sort of durable moments of predictability. They don't need to be decided in this way. They can always, in a sense, be undecided, made undurable at a particular moment and to be remade. But when they do, this also comes with additional costs. You know? This may sound a bit abstract, but we're going to go into a bit of a more direct, detailed examples of a little bit of what we mean here and as well. Now, another way to approach how this has to do with sort of the bigger picture is this Whitehead quote that leads off the chapter in the publication that's well known and oft repeated. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations that we can perform without thinking. And this would include the ways in which technical systems, as artifacts, as tool, as media, might be seen. This is not the only way to see them, and we will talk a little bit about why the limitations of understanding this way, but as, in a way, consolidations or condensations or artifactualizations of previous ideas, solutions, and decisions. Again, so those don't need to be decided again going forward. Now, we can have another discussion about what we mean by advances within this particular context. Now, let's take a step back then for a moment to locate this framing of the connotations of automation as a kind of automation of decision within a system that makes those relays more durable in this way, and link them back to this question of this propositions around technical alienation. In any number of different ways, as I list out in the book, by sundial, abacus, sextant, telescope, microscope, or TensorFlow processing unit, technologies alienate us, thankfully, hooray, from direct perceptual reckoning by enabling and conjuring novel abstractions about worldly processes, not only direct expressions, direct empirical observations of worldly processes, but also in the process of the standardization of measurement, the organization of the sort of comparability, abstractions of this particular empirical observation towards other ones that we might make comparable to it as well, and that this procedures and the capacity for this kind of abstraction of worldly processes. This one is like that one. This particular is an instance of this generic form such that when I recognize another instance of that, I can apply what I learned over here and understand it over there. This abstraction. Language is an abstraction. Mathematics is an abstraction. All forms of figurations are abstractions in this kind of way, including these sorts of closures. So sometimes these abstractions that a particular technical system allows for are inseparable from the particular technology that enables them. You can't dissociate them. They're actually one and the same thing. This technology is the thing that makes this abstraction. This abstraction is this technology. Sometimes, however, they actually can be delinked and quite different from one another. They can go their separate ways. But as they do, and even either way, it's not only that tools beget abstractions that allow for this system, but in the doing so, the abstractions themselves become tools. We learn to think not only through the tools that provide this form of abstraction, but the forms of abstraction that they provide, in essence, become codified, concretized, made durable, such that as concepts, as cognitive abstractions, they become mechanisms through which we, in turn, perceive the world. So in a way, this is another way of summarizing, in a more prosaic sense, what we would hope that the processing of the Copernican trauma might look like. So sometimes, as we've indicated in this Copernican trauma, that the abstraction that is produced and studied is one that is not the thing that, there's the model of the world that produces the technology that produces the model of the world, and there's this incongruency between the model the abstraction that the technology provides and the abstraction that set in motion that technology in the first place that would have provided this abstraction. Those are relatively rare moments. And precious in this sort of regard. What I'm speaking of here is a much more sort of general process phenomenon by which a particular technology will allow for this the development and appearance of an abstraction through its own process of mediation, such that abstraction becomes a tool that can be used independent or codependent with that technology in different kinds of ways, which in this sense, the S abstraction, we might, in a basic sense, understand as a kind of delineated and configured form of the concept. So, which causes which in this cycle? Like, which is the technology causing the abstraction causing the technology? It's in essence indecidable. The question of first mover agency in this kind of dynamic is probably indecidable and probably not something that would tell us a whole lot even if we were able to figure it out. As the idea that if we were to sort of rewind all the way back to the beginning of this relay and find out who or what, as I say, sort of push the first domino in the relay, that would tell us what it tells us, but it would not tell us all that much necessarily about the qualities, context, implications of the entire relay as a whole, right? Because that entire relay, the qualities of all of that cascading outcome, were not actually contained within some kind of premeditated conceptual intention on behalf of this form of this first mover necessarily. So we could say this. We also say at the same time, though, that that first mover or whatever that is not necessarily the kind of the royal or sovereign agent that causes the rest of these things to happen, right? You know, we can relate this back to some of the conversations we were having yesterday about the absent sovereign as being the problem in a way that we're interested in sort of solving, but in doing so in a way not with the presumption that if we, in the appearance of this absent sovereign, there will be some kind of subject that is able to preconceptualize an ideal outcome, and then in the actions and that it wishes to take through this ideal outcome, that will end up sort of solving it, but rather having to do with the enforcement of the conditions of the relay that, to some extent, we would already understand how to set in place. The first mover in this relay is not the sort of royal subject whose ideas are externalized into the qualities of the relay come in place, but it's also not any less of an agent within the entire relay itself. It also all of the agents and all of the modes within this sort of relay, all of them are maybe possessed of their own limited and tactical forms of abstraction about what they're doing and why they're doing it within the scope of this relay. All of them all the way down the line, including the one at the beginning. We're not disallowing the one at the beginning for having a sense of abstraction, but just not. But what we're being attentive to do is not to misrecognize that intention as being sort of the ultimate first cause, and finding in the first cause everything that subsequently happens next. So, and I'll get to this point a little bit more. This idea that each of the agents within the system has themselves, is their process, the way in which their ability to decide, or to decide not to decide, or to mediate this cascade as it passes through them and passes by them or around them or in resistance to them in one way or another, their actions within this relay may be ones that are undertaken through in the employment of the abstraction about the system that we were talking about, in the practical and direct application of the technologies that should move through it, or this abstraction through the technology through the abstraction. All of these possibilities are, and it works all along, all form down the line. Now, we'll unpack some of this as they used to say. So if this seems a bit dense, it's okay. You can exhale. We'll get there. Which causes which, though, again, is not so much necessarily about the first mover agency. In the densest city, the wettest jungle, determination is everywhere. Everything determining other things in one way or another. Little things determining big things determining little things, slow things determining fast things determining slow things, also down the line. It's not that there is no determination. If we say because of this, for example, it's not in this demotion of the royalty of the first mover agency, it doesn't mean that there isn't determination, but rather that determination is massively distributed. Not necessarily ubiquitously, not necessarily entropically, but distributed nevertheless. Abstractions, technologies, technical abstractions themselves indeterminate. It is dominoes toppling into dominoes all the way down, including those who are in the position to tip them over. They are, in their own way, as determined in advance by as the tippies in this as well. So this sort of illusion of autonomy within this is the point that we wish to speak to here. What at first glance
is also reaching endovascular procedures like percutaneous.
It's too loud. What at first glance, all right, I don't want to hear the play. Imagine the robot moving across the screen. This is okay. Visualize it. I want you to have this image in your head. The world is an illusion anyway. But I don't want to have the guy talk over it, so I'm going to have you do all the work. What first glance looks autonomous, like the little robot moving down the sort of the thing, self-governing, set apart, able to decide on its own. Again, autonomous as in autonomos, self-governing, is actually, upon closer inspection, something whose actions and procedures within it have already been decided in advance by some remote ancestral agent in relays. In this case, the programmers at the cell phone case factory in Shenzhen have decided in advance what it needs to decide. The little robot follows the QR codes on the floor. It doesn't need to decide what to do next because its decisions have already been decided for it. The automation that you see here is an automation of decision. The decision's taking place that in each instant in which a decision needs to be made by the little robot, the decision's already decided for it. So what it appears to allow it to be autonomous and self-governing in the repetition of this decision through its abstraction of the problem space. I see where do I go? I see the code. Okay, I go there. What do I do? I see the code. Okay, I go there. In this abstraction of the problem space, again, the decision's been decided. Okay, might as well, if we've gone through all the trouble.
Is also reaching endovascular procedures
Ta-da.
like percutaneous coronary intervention, PCI,
A
and
bit
peripheral
anticlimactic, but you get
vascular
the idea
intervention,
here.
PVI,
The
which
apparent
traditionally
autonomy
required
of our
surgeon to wear a
robot
leg.
friend is based
Using
on
robotics
what it
now
has been
lowers
taught,
risk for
what it
patients
has
and the
learned,
surgeon,
what is
while
adapted to
improving
do,
outcomes.
which all of which
Robotic
it now
surgery
repeats,
provides precision,
repeats,
flexibility, and
repeats,
control.
in
Paired
combination
with shortened recovery
over and over
time
again
and limited
without
pain,
having to
patients
decide
benefit from the
anything
continued advancements
new.
in the field.
I haven't decided anything new again, right? So again, in this sense, autonomy is less about free will than it is about the aspects of action that can be done without full deliberation or even without choice. Things like breathing. Fortunately, since we've sat here today and began the session, none of you have had to think about self-oxygenation. Otherwise, it would have been a much more dramatic situation. Driving, making, molding, remembering, blooming, pollinating, writing, all of these things are done to a greater or lesser degree without having to decide to do it. They are, in essence, in a way automated in this expanded sense that we're speaking out here as well. So if we then go back to the Whitehead quote of this civilization advances, quote unquote, in each step of things that can be taken without having to decide, we might qualify as saying things that don't have to be decided again. Things that don't have to be decided again and again and again, because they have, in a sense, already been decided. Now, the immediate and quite appropriate rejoinder to this is like, well, but decisions need revision. At any point in time, you can't, it's just a simple repetition of something going on down the line. That's not a very adaptive strategy. Nothing that would basically decide how to solve a problem within a niche once and assume that doing the same thing over and over and over and always will be equally successful is going to last very long, unless its niche is extraordinarily and unusually homeostatic. And so the question, and this goes back to the question you had earlier about agency, is another way of thinking about agency within this system of automation is the positions and moments in which either by design within the system something is left undecided, so that in each iteration, in each cycle of the system, it can be decided anew. Like, are we sure? Are we sure? Are we sure? Is this the way to do it? Showed this before. or any other moment within the system in which that had previously been an already automated decision that is now, in essence, reopened again to be redecided anew. There's no reason why in any of these relays, anything that is automated cannot be reopened and redecided anew in a way. And this question of this, is there a repetition, or is there differentiation, repetition, or some kind of mutation or evasion? Is this more general principle? It's the same principle from genetic mutation to just the Deleuzian's morphologies of difference and repetition, so forth and so on. But it obviously has a political valence as well. So in these moments of crucial choice within the system, that depend on everything that is already routinized, to spell it out, then what we call the political would have to refer not only however, not only to these sort of rare and unusual moments within the relays when there are these deliberative, self-conscious kinds of moments of executive revision and reaction and redecision in relationship to the whole relay. It would be inclusive of those, but it cannot be simply reduced to and defined entirely through this point as well. There have to be ways in which all of it would be able to define and be inclusive of all of those, the entirety of the choreographies, if you like, of all of these technically entrenched pathways. The political and the compositionality, the question of the compositionality, the questioning of the compositionality of the relay, which we will say is sort of equivalent of the politics of the automation, is understood as only interested in these moments of these relatively rare moments of redeciding. It is in essence sort of unnecessarily blind to the vast majority of ways in which decision is already embedded within these systems. It misses most of the choreography. All right, so now some of the ways in which we're talking about this might be relatively familiar to first order, second order notions of cybernetics, to a certain extent, or control theory, but also, as I've sort of intimated, I've tried to articulate this in the really sort of beginning to this process, tried to articulate this in the way that what it would be, how it is that we might describe this process would be ways that would also, that would be operating at a level of abstraction that we could also include what we understand about what we call biosemiotics within the system. That is, how it is that living systems signal internally and externally to themselves and to one another in such a way that in this signaling becomes the basis of their capacity. So there's ways in which the neural networks in your brain are kind of biosemiotics, that how the flowers and insects communicate as a kind of biosemiotic, relays and signals sent within a cell that tell it what to do or form a kind of biosemiotics here as well. Again, we want to find a way, not here, not this afternoon, but we want to find a way in which there becomes a mechanism by which the biological and the technical logic of this procedures of not only of signaling, but where, in essence, new signaling is not necessary because it's already been, the information that the signal would signal is already known and already decided in such a way. So how it nevertheless signaling persists, do we assume then that when signaling persists within that system, that what has been decided, what has been, in essence, been made durable and automated is not, is not simply that whether or not there needs to be a signal at all, but rather what that signal, in fact, would be. Is this a way of understanding and sort of from a different perspective the ways in which evolutionary adaptive strategies tend to coalesce around solutions that we might define as fit within a specific niche. Flowers evolve in a certain way to be interesting to insects. So they don't need to, there doesn't need, as long as this works, there doesn't need to be a revision. There's no reason for there to be a huge amount of genetic mutation to search the phase space of other possible phenotypical adaptations so they might look different. It doesn't need to be decided. It, in essence, becomes literally encoded in how the DNA will express itself. You know? So there become these kinds of closed circuits. All right, now, again, I'm really kind of just beginning this. There's a number of other people who I think are doing very interesting work in this area. There's another probably series of lectures that we could do just trying to unpack some of the recent thoughts in this kind of work. Some of UC Perica's discussion that he'll be getting next week. We'll touch on many of this, but this, I don't know what we call it. There's others call this kind of general semiotics. Might be a phrase for this, but I think there's other ways of thinking about it. All right. As far as the 10-year plan is concerned, the political, if it is defined as a kind of discursive consensus and dissensus, based on positions of articulation allowed by a given field of power. Now, this is essentially maybe the sort of the representationalist model that we're talking about, loses a kind of some of its footing. Instead, this general grounding ecology of automation that we're trying to sketch out describes ways in which previous cognition, previous abstractions and decisions take root within a urban environment. Should we watch that again? Sorry. Okay, it's interesting to look at. The ways in which these forms of previous cognition, abstraction decisions take root within the urban environment as part of a given niche, the niches within a technical milieu within an urban system would see in ways in which or through a similar lens by which we might describe niches, signaling, and boundary conditions within natural biological conditions, so forth and so on. The ways in which these are put to use by unforeseeable forms of futurity. So that is because, and here's the gist, because infrastructure automates decision, which side of the street should I drive on? What should that sign is now red, it's no longer green. What do I, should there be more gasoline going in the engine or less gasoline going in the engine in response to the city signaling redness at me? Because infrastructure automates decision, sometimes this automation of decision is referred to as depoliticization. That there's a depoliticization of this circumstance, because there is not the opportunity to decide what in fact is happening and what should happen and what should happen. If something is working without new deliberation. And more often than not, that absence of new deliberation is in essence exactly the point. Part of the reason you don't want, we're all in essence probably quite happy with the arbitrary semiotic association of red with stop and green with go, and that we don't have to have every time we come to the corner, we don't have to negotiate with our compatriots what in fact should be the meaning of red at this point in time, and whether or not it's appropriate that red would mean this in this way. We don't, in fact, the fact that this isn't needing to be decided is what allows for the general freedom to move through the city in a way that is predictable. And that in this deciding of the durability of these protocological decisions within that infrastructure, again, is in fact what allows for this general mobility to be operated in this way. And this automation of the protocols and their general mobility also mean in some ways that that if there is a decision that is made that is in essence one that allows for, that is structured in such a way as to direct that infrastructure towards a more egalitarian form of spatial access, that because this is encoded physically and instantiated in the infrastructure, it's much more difficult for that to be revisited later on by someone else who might want to wield their power influence over this decision later in time. So this is, again, this codification is also part of them, of this more egalitarian sort of point. Now, in the previous program, we talked a lot about this phenomenon in relationship to platform protocols. And in a nutshell, I'll sort of summarize the notion like this. One of the perhaps paradoxical logics of platform systems is that they allow for the integration and input from in principle, any user input position that is able to connect with that system according to the predefined protocols of that system, in such a way that the system is radically agnostic as to who or what or when or why that agent is interested in connecting with the system. It's actually it's a form in a way of a kind of radical suffrage, if you like, of the agent, of the positions by which that someone would be able to sort of access this kind of structure. But this is dependent, perhaps paradoxically at first glance, on the standardization and fixity, durability of the protocol that defines that position of access. For example, sort of classic, obvious at-hand example, the TCP/IP Internet Protocol, kind of a crap protocol in a lot of ways, really inefficient handshaking protocol. Like, are you there? Yes, I'm there. Are you sure you're there? Yes, I'm sure you're there. Are you still there? Yes, I'm still there. It's like a very boring conversation. And there's probably lots of other ways to do this. But anything, animal, vegetal, mineral, old, young, fast, slow, that wishes to communicate with something else according to, and does so according to the prescriptions of the TCP/IP protocol, can connect to anything else that's on the internet. You can be a person, you can be a refrigerator, you can be a car, you can be a tall person, short person, you can be a citizen, a non-citizen. It doesn't matter. The apparatus is designed in such a way that it is, in this regard, radically open in a way that doesn't even need to foresee the parameters of the subjectivity, if you like, of whatever it is that wishes to connect with the sort of the system. It is designed in such a way that it will take all comers. Yep. But this is so because this protocol is fixed, standardized. That the standardization of the protocol is in fact, its genericness is in fact what allows for its universality, this delimited form of a universality. Perhaps in the same way that a street grid allows for lots of different sort of idiosyncratic, self-directed movements throughout a city, because it becomes this sort of open structure, sort of open territory in this regard. The point, simply to relate back to this as well, is that the question of how it is that a decision is formulated and concretized into one of the sort of the interface components of the system, and the relation to the political valence or implications of that standardization is not so clear. The presumption that in sometimes quite right complaint or critique that if a system is in essence, the key aspects in the system have been made undecidable, that this making undecidable is a depoliticization of something that in fact should be decidable, redecided in some sort of way. That this, the presumption as the infrastructure gets fixed, things that should be continuously contested can no longer be contested, and that this is a depoliticization of the infrastructure, needs to be understood at the same time, holding two seemingly contradictory ideas in our head simultaneously, and to resolve them. At the same time, with the understanding that many of those systems are made to be universally accessible, formally egalitarian in their in the capacities for who, what, when might be access them, because of the standardization. The standardization is in fact the means by which they are the means by which they are made open in one way or another, and that this has itself a direct, not abstract, political valence as well. Both of these are true. In the second example, I might sort of mean it this way. If that system works throughout having there be some sort of new deliberation, which again is often more likely the point, certain types of things that might otherwise be a political decision, like where should the water come from and who should get water, becomes instead simply the infrastructural axiom of turning on a tap faucet. Anybody or anything that turns on a tap faucet gets the water. We've already figured this out. We don't have to decide this in advance. That whole relay of moving water from one part of the landscape to another part of the landscape, building interfaces to that relay system into special rooms in all of the buildings in which we sort of build, such that this access to it is available to anybody or anything in principle at any time. The reason that this functions again, the reason that the city has this affordance, which is egalitarian in this aspect, is because of the codification of these decisions in infrastructure that does not need to be revisited again. So, as I say, the meeting of the People's Assembly for water provision can go home. Okay. We call back to the moment to these questions, relating this back to this question of the technologies of disenchantment. This is not to suggest that, and I want to sort of hold on to this moment, that of the ways in which these relays within the system might work such that they are decidable or undecidable in a kind of across a kind of spectrum rather than a binary. This is not to suggest that these circuits between a cognitive abstraction and a technical automation always or even really tend towards something like a kind of, or need to tend towards a total stable equilibrium. And certainly not ideal plans and plots. The point is certainly not to try to the plan is to pre-decide everything. It is not the premise that the goal is to, in essence, to vaccinate the system against the potential risk of future decision. Some of the ways in which any technology would encode abstraction and automate a decision is, this is a more descriptive frame, can be quite durable. Languages are ways in which we the transformation of a concept into denotation is made, in essence, durable. And because of the durability of it, that the same sound and shape means the same thing over a period of time. And we can predict with relative ease that we know what each other mean, allows for a certain degree of competence and access. Calendars, formulas, these are durable forms of automations, abstractions, where other ones might be quite fleeting. A new word that comes into the lexicon, or a new connotation of a word that is used in a different sort of way. That the innovation of the connotation in it itself is and one that may in fact appear anew and may last for a short period of time is no less important, no less interesting. A kind of event, a flavor, as in a sort of a recipe. So even these fleeting forms, however, might be transformational to the worlds in which they appear. For the instance of these variations in the innovation system isn't just sort of to say that because they may come and go relatively quickly that they are ineffectual. It may in fact be quite the opposite. There isn't a relation between this durability, the speed of that durability, and its actual and its sort of effects. Now, back to the technology for a moment. In relation to these abstractions, sometimes technologies will emerge for one particular purpose. Like we have a problem, we wish to solve this problem, and we're going to build that sort of tool to do this. Most people, learn programming this way. You don't necessarily learn how to a programming language in the same way that you learn, German or French through grammar. You learn it by having to solve a problem, and then you figure out backwards how it works. But in fulfilling that purpose, they may reveal not only that the purpose that they were intended to work back upon was not what we thought it was, but once again, that the world in which that purpose exists may also be rather different than what we thought it was, right? This is the sort of version of this Copernican turn. So some of these, which are designed as very narrow purpose instruments, come to persist through generations. So if the technologies are also forms of this abstraction and an automation and concretization of these abstractions, and we're saying that those abstractions have a sort of a valence and variance in their durability, then that would have to apply then also to the technologies themselves. There may be technologies that are relatively durable. There's ones that are relatively fleeting. Some persist through generations, evolving and speciating, because what they revealed, what they were able to act upon in the world became normalized, that they worked as tools. And in a way, the world reshaped itself in order to accommodate in this way. The successfulness of hammers begat the evolutionary success of nails. Such that original problem and even the alienating surprise that the problem, the way I imagine the problem to work, once I've solved the problem, I understand that the problem actually is a different problem than I thought it was in the first place, and this sort of changes things. Those, in essence, sometimes can be forgotten. Like those moments of that sort of alienating revelation can be forgotten because it seems like the world is, in a way, it always has been that way. The world that is revealed is then, is one of many possibilities, but then the path by which this technology revolves then becomes to kind of enforce that emergence in one way or another. All right, now, on this, back to this question of the sort of, again, I'm sort of restitching this once about it, sort of make one step, tie it down, one step, tie it down, one step, tie it down. Back to this, the Copernican trauma and this relationship to this as what we're discussing as a problematic for design. All of these pathways are, as the man said, both remedy and poison. They are to indicate that the ways in which that abstraction becomes durability, the durability becomes an abstraction. This is not a qualitative value judgment on the thing. It is both, again, sort of both good and bad at the same time. But at linking this sort of general description of this process to our contemporary moment and the ways in which, and linking it to some of the discussions we were having yesterday about the cultures of and about technology. While sometimes, quite rightly, anxieties and fears and criticisms of a new technology are expressed in descriptions of, in the accounts of the potential and real pernicious effects of the technology, that this technology can do, and in fact makes it easier to do, these particular bad things, and therefore we have this legitimate suspicion of the technology itself. Also, in many cases, however, the unease about this technology may have less to do with what it does, but rather in what it reveals that is not new, but which has been there all along. The revelation and in essence what we call this alienation or perturbance of our understanding of the world is itself not even just the source of the unease, it is the unease itself in relationship to technology. So, for example, as I sort of oft repeated, microscopes do not cause microbes. I hope we may have some disagreement on this, but microscopes actually do not cause microbes to happen. But once we use the microscope and we know that they're there, we never look at surfaces the same way. We never see surfaces the same way ever again. And in fact, in the unease about the reality of the fact that there are disease-causing microanimals covering the surface of the world around us, this may introduce, not unpredictably, some unease about whether or not microscopes were a good idea. We talked a little bit earlier about heliocentrism and telescopes. It's probably a similar kind of thing. The smashing of the mob smashing telescopes is a little bit more common occurrence than the smashing of microscopes, but you get the point. Some of these unrequested demystifications, there's not necessarily what we wanted, necessarily what we asked these technologies to do, and yet they did it anyway. And again, the point is not that with the technology we could do something new, and that it allowed us to have a different. There's both of these are both true. In this case, what we're talking about is not how the technology allowed us to do something new, extend our corporeality, to transform our embodiment of the world, our capacity for industry, for transformation, in this coextensive interiorization of thought. But in this case, rather, this ontological function of the technology, that in its revelation of something that was not new but had been there all along. And I would argue that in addition to legitimate concerns about the potentially pernicious effects of many of the supposedly revolutionary promises of what is colloquially called fourth industrial revolution technologies, things like AI and robotics and synthetic biology, machine vision, 3D manufacturing, so forth and so on, and a questioning of to what extent is the sum of the outcomes of in the deployment of these things good or harm, and for sure we won't always even be able to tell which is which. There is, in addition to this, I think another sort of important starting point for us and for the framing reference for it, that in many cases the deeper implications of these technologies is that in the ways in which they will demand, and do demand already, a different understanding of our relation to the world in which we are situated based on what they demonstrate and reveal by surprise, which was not the intention of the development of the technology as a purely functional instrument, but which may form the basis of, in fact, what we do want to do with it instead. Namely things that have in essence, one of the revelation, things have always been automated. So to make this point clear, the argument that I'm trying to build a little bit step by step here and work out with you is not that with the arrival of more pervasive forms of cybernetic automation, that there is now a new and a wholly unprecedented relationship between technical systems and biological systems, that in the past everything was sort of separate, but now there is the new thing, and the new thing is this cyborgian amalgamation. This is not the argument at all. The argument, however, is that in the appearance and pervasiveness of these automated systems, in addition to the things that they do, one of the things that they reveal is that this process of what we are identifying as automation is in fact a general principle of biological and technical integration and always has been. So, again, while some of these technologies are certainly capable of, not capable, but are deeply in the midst of reorganizing personal and planetary economies in new ways, the more durable and perhaps significant impact is not in what they do, but in what they reveal that it is not new. For example, just to sort of make a quick napkin sketch of those, AI reveals that intelligence is an emergent effect of organized matter. Whether that matter can be organic, that matter can be inorganic, it can take mammalian form, it can be built out of carbon, wet carbon, it can be built out of electrified rocks. You can assemble matter in different ways, and in different ways it will exude effects that are recognizable as different, not the same, but different forms of intelligence, including our own. And so as we think about thinking, we can't think about thinking in the same way again once we understand that thinking is also something that folded electrified rocks are doing next door, right next to us, and we right next to it. Robotics reveals that autonomy, what we perceive as being autonomy, is in essence a kind of aesthetic effect of the automation of decision, not its absence. Yep. It's the automation of decision, not the capacity for the thing to constantly be making new decisions. Right? The autonomy of the automation is not held in the fact that it is constantly making new decisions, but rather in the fact that it's not. Synthetic biology reveals that the living chemistry, to our phylochemical premises, that the living chemistry within us is, and always has been, as mutable as the chemistry outside of us. The mutability of matter outside of us through sort of the culinary chemical process, the alchemy of cuisine, introducing fire to things in such a way that we transform it into a way that now can be the matter, the exterior matter of the world that becomes us through ingestion. That the mutability of the inside that the inside chemistry is just as mutable as the outside chemistry. That should change how the lived experience within a body that is built of such mutable chemical processes. The machine vision reveals that the boundary between information sensing and information processing is actually much more blurry and contingent than we may have understood it. That, again, to the Cartesian tradition of a separation of the sense, the capacity for a sensory system to input information, and then some kind of secondary executive function of mind to give order to this information, is further discredited as we understand, we build artificial vision systems, artificial sensing systems in which, again, that boundary between information sensing and processing is so functionally blurry that you even try to attempt to differentiate it in these sorts of things as well seems to be, begins to lose traction right away. Nanotechnology, all the things that we call this, reveals that the table of elements is as much an interface as a map. That part of this mutability of the molecular realm operates this way. Additive manufacturing reveals that, again, that previous modes of industrial society, including the ways in which we zone cities around located industrial assembly, were perhaps far too rooted in place. And on and on and on and on. I mean, there's lots of different ways in which each of these technologies, which are lots of technologies, could be characterized in this way, but just as a kind of to get the ball rolling. Included in that would also be that cities are actual ecologies. They're not metaphors for an ecosystem. forests and jungles are not metaphors for cities. That cities, in fact, are actual ecologies that are built of forms of chemistry all across this table of elements. There tends to be, in some cases, a lot more things that have a lot less carbon in them that are more durable, which we think of as metal and wood, buildings and so forth and so on. But they are, in fact, actual ecologies and have to be understood within. They are also what we might call theaters of mutualizing automation. It's not just that we set in motion our abstractions, which are concretized into a system to build automated systems that surround us in this prosthetic realm. We too are part of those automated systems. Our role and positions within those relays is one as medium and object as much as it is of subject as well. The ways in which each of us as living in a city internalizes and is internalized by these relays of automation shouldn't be insulting. It's a different kind of, it's in fact a different kind of grounding. It's not that humans, again, it's not that humans and technologies are now, lo and behold, merging. It's not, what the arguments for put is not a kind of singularity sort of thing, for example, or not sort of ways in which it's like that there is this post-human moment by which this clearly defined and understood and relatively stable thing called the human and this clearly defined and relatively stable thing called the technology, which have always been the way, are now in this peculiar and moment near the end of history are combining in some sort of amazing way. There are forms of combination that are new and interesting, but the fact of combination itself is archaic. In fact, we evolved. Our very anatomy appears in relationship to those amalgamations. You have opposable thumbs because your ancestors used tools. It's not that your ancestors used tools because they had opposable thumbs. Like, we are the effect of this amalgamation at the most fundamental level of our structures of embodiment. The ways in which we have these perhaps strangely extreme forms of biological and technical amalgamation that we might identify and get very excited about or fearful about in relationship to these sort of cyber organizations one way or another. This, in essence, I'm saying is like, yes, it will allow us to do new and interesting things, but again, the more fundamental thing is that they reveal something that is actually quite old, right? And that may in fact be what they do. Okay. Some technologies make this more clear than others, but is this how they are generally discussed? Is this, it was sitting through, probably is a better way, some of the talks from Davos a couple weeks ago, just as a kind of masochistic exercise, and lots of blah blah about all of these same technologies. Is this how they are discussed there? No, of course not. There, it's the sort of party line of these. They are presented in kind of simplistic parables about how these mechanisms will offer a seamless empowerment of self-transparent human subjects and societies that characterize, in fact, in certain ways, the absolute opposite of the way in which I'm trying to discuss them with you here. In some ways, it would be better if they said nothing at all. In many ways. Okay. Just to then restitch this back to this this premise of the Copernican turn within design. The kinds of design practices and forms of a different way of this question of agency, the forms of design agency that are perhaps directly or indirectly implied by this, may be ones that shift certain balances in some ways. There's a shift in balance, if you like, from a focus on experience. Not that these things are unimportant, but rather a tipping in the sort of the relative weight we might give to things as criteria of importance. From experience and the experience of experience toward the designation of outcomes. Instead of the designing systems in relationship to how it is that each of the self-referential user subjects within the system experience their experience of the system, fine, our job is done. In fact, rather the design of the system from working backwards from impersonal outcomes for the system. Perhaps a bit more like what engineers are used to doing. Again, a shift in relative weight between users and the systems themselves, a shift in emphasis from aesthetics towards access, that the politics of the system is understood is more important than the capacities for the determination and expansion of forms of, and calibration of forms of access to the system rather than the aesthetic of the system. A shift from intuition to abstraction, which we've talked about in a number of different ways, and perhaps from expedience to ideals as well, which speaks to the interest in the longer terms. So I think the implications for design more generally, this weirdly professionalized position of the designator of things is perhaps fundamental, and ones that will maybe deserve some further questions. So to elucidate and amplify some of the things we were talking about yesterday about over-individuation, and the way and the ways in which we may attempt to index some of the pathologies of design culture more generally as the outcomes of this over-individuation. Starting with Vitruvian man, the single serving Homo sapien individual whose proxemic measurements become literally the measure of all things, to Facebook profiles later on. These centuries of what came to be called human-centered design, which in one way or another you've probably all been indoctrinated in one way or another, have brought with them more usable tools. Human-centered design has made it so that, like, the faucets in hotel showers all work roughly the same way. Fine. Thermometers are more readable. Dashboards on cars make more sense. It's easier to order things on websites, things like this. These are all, I'm happy for most of these. Like, I'd rather, the inverse situation is probably less interesting. But when this is raised to a general universal principle, it becomes clear that the premise of design as such, if understood through this as its real core function, that the premise of design itself is human centricity, individuated human centricity, then quite clearly the whole process is far too psychologizing. It understands that problem space primarily through a psychologization of the problem space, far too individuating, far too anthropocentric, anthropomorphizing, and so forth. So in addition to making all of these things more instantaneously more legible and useful and simplified, it also has brought part of what it brought with it also our landfills of consumer goods and social media sophistry, an inability to articulate futures beyond these narrow cliches. In other words, in the name of amplifying the individual's desire, okay, something we're going to figure out what people want and we're going to give it to them. That the real problem of design was that it wasn't giving people what they want. We're going to figure out what they want and we're going to give it to them. I was always like, this, in a certain sense, this has been successful, and that's the problem. That the problem of this, the problem of the mechanisms of human-centered design, particularly, we can take this social media sophistry as sort of example here, is not that these systems don't give people what they want. The problem is that that's all they do. The problem is all this sort of does. It's not a suppression of interest in design and agency. It's quite the opposite. It's in fact a kind of pathological amplification of the externalization of desire through this. This repression hypothesis out the window. In that sense, maximizing usability, in other words, came at the expense of a far deeper reason. And we would hope that this Copernican shift in the philosophy of design would, to put it directly, include a rotation away from human-centered design. In this sense, particularly the over-individuated form, and towards a fuller understanding of designing of the human and the world as a kind of always inextricable circuit. And to be clear, I don't mean this sort of the design that is post-human in some kind of transhumanist sort of way. That's not, just to make sure this isn't the connotation of this, but rather that the design of physical media that is more than only the composing of augmentations of an individuated given subject and form, and so forth. So, a book that I think does a quite admirable job of developing a kind of alternative history of modern design from the presumption of a starting point that's quite similar to what we're talking about is the little yellow book by Mark Wigley and Beatrice Colomino called Are We Human? We can put it on your sort of reading list here as today. So it's not that, in essence, that we have to start over from scratch. There is a way in which we can understand this history in this way as well. So this Copernican shift then, I think quickly, assumes design's artificiality. It assumes that this designation function is about the deliberate and artificial reconstructions of things. It is perhaps far more comfortable with it, but this doesn't imply necessarily the idea of mastery. Right? And I want to sort of like take a moment to sort of enter at this point. The presumption that in this sort of Copernican revelation, it's not just that it's a de-anthropocentrizing thing, but it's a moment in which what is and isn't, and what is and isn't plastic and mutable about the human position is made more explicit. And in its making of explicit, the possibility of its agency is in fact made more clear and direct. What is made clear and direct is not that we have total mastery over the system, and therefore can reserve it anyway. But because one of the things that this reveals is not just that there is a possibility that technology will spin out of control. One of the things it revealed is that technology never was under our control in the first place. That is one of the things that is revealed, and therefore has to be understood as this starting point. Which, if so, would make both these positions of what are sometimes called technological determinism and social reductionism sort of obsolete. So let me speak then to, as we try to expand this idea from the individual scale to the societal scale. Another sort of way in which I want to sort of nuance the differentiation here is in relationship to is the differentiation to the understanding that the technologies in which we are working, in which we are embedded, are essentially informed and animated primarily by the dynamics and social logics of our society. That they are in a way not anthropomorphic but sociomorphic, that they are the way they are because our society has in essence determined them to be so in one way or another, that they can be read as ideological symptoms whose real origin exists within our society itself, that they are only projections of something that we have created and understood as sort of themselves. This is kind of the strong social constructivist view of the technology. The technology itself has no real function or agency. It's really a reflection of power relations, historical conditions that are precedent to it as well, of which it is a kind of haunted mechanism. And this hauntology of the technology is the basis by which we would want to address it, by understanding and rereading and perhaps prosecuting the technology as an ideological conflation. This is a different kind of anthropomorphization of the technology. Not anthropocentrism, but anthropomorphization of it, but not as an understanding of the technology as a reflection of the singular Vitruvian man, but rather the technology as a kind of projection of ourselves as a society, our history, our understanding of our own history within this system. That's a kind of animism. That's a kind of animism, this projection of that the things in the world are in essence really characters in a drama that we possess. Finally. And I think there's ways in which certain approaches to the strong social constructivist view of technology appear and operate in relationship to the traumas of the revelation of what those technologies provide. That what sometimes appears as and sometimes is a quite legitimate criticism of the social and economic effects and history of that technology, which is not only not dismissing, I would argue, is extremely central and important to any of the concerns here. Sometimes also the ways in which that premise and that is undertaken through the argument that the technology itself is this projection and haunted arrangement of this sort of externalization of an ideological relationship of power within society, is sometimes also, I think, a kind of defensive response to the implications of what the technology reveals and the disorientation of the revelation in such a way that it would imply that the individual and the centrality of an individual or social agency in the determination of the technology is in fact not quite so as determining as we might have thought it to be. And so there's a way in which to try to recapture it, to sort of re-wrap our arms around it again, to say, no, in fact, is under our control. It's under our control in a bad way as opposed to under our control in a good way, but it is in fact still ours. It is in fact still a projection of our agency. Our agency and the centrality of our intentions is not to be demoted. So this perspective might say something like, that machine that challenges our self-image, it was made by our history. Despite what it tells us, despite what it reveals, it is still our mirror. This, and I'm characterizing this, caricaturizing this quite without a doubt. This sort of reductive social determinism is another not only pervasive anthropocentrism, but an anthropomorphism, one which paradoxically in some ways works against the acceptance of the artificial, even as it tries to see our fingerprints and agency everywhere. The implication, again, we'll repeat this, the implication is that in many ways that this attempt to re-see technology as essentially a reflection of our history, as something that is fundamentally to be understood as something that is haunted by our own actions, that is a projection of ourselves externalized into the world, a radical anthropomorphization of the external technical world, actually is the end effect, which I'll sort of hope to show, is one that is unable to conceptualize, accept, and grasp the conditions of the artificiality that we're trying to sort of work with here, even as, in a sort of direct sense, its most fundamental conclusions is that our fingerprints are everywhere, and our agency is everywhere, and absolutely everything is because of us. Because of our past sins, because of the past violence, because of the past whatever, or the present. Now, there's obviously lots of different versions of this. In versions of this that what we might easily identify as both from a kind of political right as well as political left. In certain ways, they're feeble in complementary ways. The conservative humanism, again, sort of being ventriloquizing these in a very perfunctory way, is very too quick to conclude that, in essence, what it understands as human cultures move away from a previous position of supervisory mastery over some subservient machinery in the long ago times, or sometimes not so long ago, in the previous era before things started going wrong, before modernity usually, when men were men and women were women and cats and dogs didn't mingle or whatever. In this conservative view of when there was this proper moment of over our supervisory mastery over subservient machinery, that if we were to sort of move away from this idea, that we were to sort of argue like, no, actually, it was never been under our control. It's always been a way in which there's sort of this sort of coextensive amalgamation. In many ways, sort of the initial response from this position to the news that these premises are much more fragile is in a way in which it sort of it attempts to imagine what the inverse of its own social deterministic position would be, and says that the external criticism of it is in essence a technological determinism. Maybe we should say, in the social deterministic view, the revelation that this social determinism is in fact far more fragile and convoluted than its premises would hold. The presumption of, in many cases, like what they hear you saying is the inverse of their position, and they think what you're arguing in essence is a kind of equally reductive technological determinism. That if it's not the people that are determining the machines, if you're telling me that's not the case, then you must be saying it's the machines determining the people, and that can't be, that sort of can't be so. Okay? Or a kind of relativistic vitalism, which we've discussed a little bit in terms of this discussion of animism. So sometimes this conservatism draws from an explicit or implicit anti-secularism, and in this I mean really the capital C conservative view of how it is that technology has in fact destroyed, their conception of how technology has destroyed this sort of proper traditional culture. Oswald Spengler and these kinds of this kind of thing, and in many respects that history of the criticism of technology as being this thing that has fundamentally disoriented our proper nature comes from the political right, whether that's Spengler or obviously Heidegger. The Heideggerian criticism, as you know, has also influenced many of this sort of forms the basis, even though it begins on the political right, forms the basis of the post-structuralist social deterministic linguistification of the world in ways that are more obvious than they perhaps first appear. Okay, another angle on this, and one in which I think there's still quite a bit to recuperate, but to perhaps improve, of a different sort of genre of the social deterministic view of technology. Or in this sense, is one that is more explicitly social and culturally constructivist. That is, that the technical systems themselves should be understood primarily in terms of how it is that a particular society and culture conceptualizes and understands the significance and meaning of these things, which is in itself as continued as any kind of linguistic construction. And at the end of the day, this is the best we can do in terms of really understanding the operations here as well. Sometimes the social constructivism is deployed in a way as a way to try to underwrite as we were talking a little bit about yesterday, a kind of ontological egalitarianism that we might see it in this way, we might see it in that way. This position within a social order sees the circumstances like this. This position in a social order sees the positions like this. If we want to credentialize the position itself, if we want to recognize and validate the validity of the position as such, then this perhaps too quickly translates into we must essentially decide that the concepts organized from each of those positions have a essentially equivalent usefulness for us. So the equivalent, they have this kind of equivalence in themselves. Now, so as the former conservative model would have it, technology should be an organic reflection of cultural tradition. This church thing over here, across the street, they rebuilt to look like it was really old. But after modernity, that order was upended and so should be properly restored, even as a simulationist wedding cake version of itself. For the latter, for the social constructivist model, technology can only really be a vessel of human culture, human discourse. It is only really an expression of our cosmology. And so it should be defined, resisted, or championed primarily on those terms, as problems, as translated as on discursive terms, because it itself is essentially discursive. So instead, I would argue that this design of, the form of design that we're looking at of the planetary scale socio-technical assemblages, planning, what we're calling planning, means putting the inter-evolutionary dynamics of what is called society and technology along a different kind of artificially coordinated path. The premise is not to subordinate one side of this far too simplistic equation to the determination of the other. In fact, it's the notion that it's the sort of the unfortunate separation of these as conceptual domains suggests that it's not simply that the novelty of the re-amalgamation at this point is the way forward, but rather than the more fundamental understanding of that they have never been separate in the first place. The planned ecologies and economies at hand are then not just transformed through these new technologies, reflecting some kind of human intention, but they are conceptualized and deployed in relationship to these, the implications, however uncomfortable, of the revelations and disclosures themselves. So maybe another way of putting it, in a sense, there is only, if we are inside of this, only technological determination, but that the determination is itself indeterminate and contingent. Okay. To this culture thing. As indicated, I think our project begins, therefore, from leading from what we just discussed, starting point that includes a suspicion that what is called culture represents a unique good in and of itself. This position is not that what is called culture is therefore bad, but rather a criticism that the premise that in and of itself it represents a transcendental value we hold in some parenthetical qualification. And that what we call culture, our culture, we would also be suspicious of the idea that it is something that is fundamentally and ontologically different than merely functional symbolization, that culture is a qualitatively different and more immaterial domain that is elevated from the general biosemiotics. And so in this sense, the ways in which the social constructivist position seeks to see technology as itself a discursive construction is half right in a way in which it, in fact, wouldn't necessarily recognize. If we understand that our processes of symbolization and signal making and semiotics is in fact a technical material process, then the technical material processes themselves would be inclusive of those semiotics. But this is not the form. This is not the linguistification that they are looking for. All right. So, and again, I was sort of say that this, just to make this clear, as the questioner earlier about the anti-human whether or not this implies this as well or implies this. Again, I think that the implication of the Copernican turn is not only just to sort of move the human offside or demote this, but also to make more explicit what in fact the limited and potentially plastic thing called the human is. We are particularly over this last 60,000 years, we've had a very good run. We are kind of marvelous, astronomically unlikely form of matter that has, and as we learn more about like who and what and where is in our local neighborhoods, galactically in our solar system, the unlikeliness of us becomes more clear as well. And this unlikeliness is, to my way of thinking, quite marvelous. We are then this particularly unique and, again, I think marvelous way in which matter, a way in which matter signals to matter about the world through the fleshly mediated abstractions and physical expressions of ourselves individually and collectively. So again, I think it is saying so that we really that this kind of this self-regard in relationship to this material processes that we're talking about. To me, I don't see this as a degradation of what it means to be human, though that's certainly the way in which it has been accused of being. I don't think it's any more degrading to say that we don't possess literal souls or something like this as well. In fact, I think that in a way it's the real story. The real story that in fact over this period of 4 billion years and then later 3 million years and 60,000 years of succession, that this bipedal binocular primates would manage to sort of walk around and do things and figure out these different forms of signaling simulation and eventually do things like assemble telescopes on the side of the planet so that the planet itself could look 50 million years in sort of the past. This is a far more, to me, amazing narrative, if you like, than the Earth was created in 7 days and there was a resurrection and a zombie and stuff like this. This just seems like it's just not as good of a story to me. But this is more of an aesthetic preference, I suppose. But I just want to sort of make the case is I think the implications of this is not one is not a kind of a morose resignation to a miserable and disenchanted void. Quite the opposite. It makes things, hopefully, I think, actually more wondrous than before. So, more specifically, through this sort of radical materialist frame that we were sort of talking about, our performed cognitions and expressions are seen as the emergence effects of matter organized by its cyclical adaptation within and through the world around it, one that is always available to artificial redesign. And this is sort of the point. In this revelation and specification of what the human is and isn't, what part of also is what is made explicit is how the human is constantly being available to transformation at both the individual and societal level. That plasticity is made explicit. Because what is human is not, all this because the human is one specific frame through which this emergent forms of capacities for cognition appears one material substrate. However, and back to this critique of culture sort of for a moment, it also, however, makes clear that these marvelous symbolic expressions that we have gotten so good at are meaningful specifically, not generally, and that their meaning and their significance specifically is in relationship to these adaptive relays, which may be variously automated or not automated, in which we are embedded. That they are not a kind of transcendental virtual realm, but are in fact deeply embedded within the process itself. that as our symbolizations are formulated as abstractions, those abstractions become technologies, those technologies become abstractions all the way on through. It isn't a suggestion that our thoughts and our language and our symbols are sort of unimportant, but rather that they are, in fact, physical, and that the physicality of them is what makes them important, what makes them interesting, and what makes them relevant in this regard. Part of the pathology of them, and perhaps the surplus of symbolization in which we swim, has to do with a misrecognition of this physicality. So, up to the economics of this. As we see these various shifts and transformation, what is and isn't automated, and in the more literal and sort of prosaic everyday sense of automation, of like robots doing things that people used to do, and people doing things that robots used to do, and this intensification of embedded algorithmic intelligence into fourth order cybernetic systems, it plays out unevenly, to say the least. It does so in ways that are organized around, that have everything to do with the residual effects of the sociological and anthropological catastrophes that are just as much as part of the Anthropocene as the chemical aspects of it as well. It's also, I think, in terms of this question of understanding the economic transformations at the level of the sort of the embodiment of that replacement itself. It's important also, I think, I mean, one of the things we've been looking quite a lot at is the ways in which this notion of replacement and displacement has been an extremely gendered formulation. So, for example, I mean, just to sort of speak quickly to this, in the sense that in many ways, more recently, it's been feminist theory of technology that has placed a much more direct emphasis on the mutualist symbiosis of bodies, including cyborgian bodies of man machine, but also biological bodies. Lynn Margulis's symbiotic theory of evolution, so forth and so on. It's hard not to observe that the quote replacement trope, that this person is being replaced, that there is a person that is doing a person thing, and it's being improperly displaced by the machine thing, and it's one or the other. That the boundary of one is fixed, the boundary of the other is fixed, and there is this replacement, and the replacement is dangerous. Has to do with is a scenario that hits hardest for men, and for ways in which the economy has been organized around certain kinds of fragile masculinities of the machine. Yang's references to the truck drivers and automation is largely true, but it's one that has not just to do with the mobility of objects. It has to do with, I think, a rather specific gendered mastery, gendered construction of personal mastery and control over technology itself. And that sense of mastery is the thing that is, in a certain sense, is being punctured, or at least destabilized by the implications of the automation. All right, let me try to go a little bit quicker so we've got some time for some discussion around this as well. In this page, here is sort of the point in which we say a few more unkind things about the legacies of post-structuralism, or the linguistic, or the sort of linguistic reduction here as well. I'll put it in sort of in this phrase, in this sense. The commonsensical notion that we repeated quite often, and is that the Anthropocene, or what we call the Anthropocene, you can call it what you like. In my sense, the Anthropocene is, the way I see it, is Anthropocene is a much longer period of time. It goes back about 11,000 years. What you might call the capital scene or something is a much sort of shorter period. Actually, in my way of thinking, they're just not the same thing. They're kind of different transformations. The beginning of industrialization, the beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago. The movement of human populations across into North America and South America, the disappearance of North American megafauna. This has happened a long, long time ago, and this is also an Anthropocenic effect. Regardless, let's talk about the more recent one. This, the one that is coterminous with modernity. The idea that the Anthropocene itself is largely is fundamentally due to technology run amok. Is, I think, in fact, I would take exception to this and argue that in fact what is the real sort of root recipe of this is the humanist, with a capital H, legacy that understands the world as having been given for our needs and created in our image. Now, this means not just logging and mining and extraction. It also means theories that see the world and the planet and the politico-geographical phenomena of the Anthropocene itself as something that has been generated foremost by particular cultural narratives, and so is to be understandable particularly through and vulnerable to cultural critique. That, in essence, that the premise that the world is here for us to experience and that our experience of the world is the function of the world, that the world is there for us to project the narrative logic, the anthropomorphic and atomistic narrative logics onto it, is the function of is what the world is for. This linguistification, if you like, of the world. This is the core recipe of the Anthropocene. Art causes climate change. So, projects, the legacy of post-structuralism, the projects for which the representation of the world causes the world more than the other way around, or that the co-planetarity of organisms and machines and ecologies are really just, at the end of the day, characterizations in a big contested text, are themselves an ineffectual, as I would say, an ineffectual expression of what we might identify as a kind of first world animism. So, and in this sense, given that I think this frame of reference has been so central to the theoretical catechism in the West, it's hard for me, especially after 68, it's hard for me not to wonder in a sense of like, if the aftermath at this point, the real legacy on the tombstone of post-structuralism is that is how it has hamstrung how the humanities address planetarity today. That part of the sort of the noise around these questions that we're trying to sort of deal with today is the confusion of how it is that a way of thinking that is so fundamentally a linguistic reduction of the world can address a circumstance that is so obviously indifferent to language. And its attempts to do so by redefining that circumstance in discursive terms. That this isn't like, and the question is, how do we unmake this? Is this just another, in other words, is this just another way in which the inflated self-regard of the now convalescing boomer 68 generation refuses to let go of the steering wheel and let us get on with the job of cleaning up its mess? Yes, the answer is yes, just to give it just sort of cut to the chase here as well. In terms of the 2030 deadlines, something else is a little bit sort of needed. All right, we're getting a little bit closer to the end here. How do we make sense of humans within these kinds of algebraic, in terms of these cascades? And I want to sort of end this section a little bit of discussion of other ways of thinking about our relationships of these systems and sort of systems in place. Each of these sort of automated systems has its own, again, makes its own sort of demands of variance and invariance within its particular and specific technical enclosures and procedures and so forth, in these ways in which automation are coextensive. one of the things that this makes clear is that all our forms of artificial embodiment are themselves always sort of configured through the relative terms that themselves are never fully autonomous. That even as we are coextensive with these procedural mechanisms, that this doesn't mean that this makes clear our lack of autonomy, not the lack of corporeal autonomy, not the clarity of that corporeal economy. And I'll show you a sort of example of what we mean by this. These cascading relays, as you see here, may be choreographed by planned abstractions of the whole sequence. That is, each of the instances within the sequence may have a model may be operating according to a little local model of the whole sequence. Just as they imprint particular improvisational decisions along the way as they go. There's ways in which each of these tries to sort of steer this, nevertheless, of how the deciding has been decided, learning as they go and bending this choreography in new ways. As these chain reactions aggregate at infrastructural scale, they, one by one and group by group, encode not only new abstractions, but also new decisions that can be repeated again and again. Right? And so these are not only, in addition to the ways in which the function of the automation is to pre-decide decision, that in addition to this, all of these that we've sort of talked about, the construction of each of these systems is moments in which the decisions cannot be entirely decidable in advance. And to the extent that each of the little creatures or nodes or positions within this decision is also operating perhaps not only through an abstracted understanding of the specific relay that it is responsible for, but also through a model of the entire relay in which it understands itself to be embedded. This process of recursion within the system, by which the little thing is imagining the big thing and transforming its actions and redeciding ever so slightly based on its understanding of what's going on in the big system, is how it works. Over and over it goes. Now, for us, to the extent to which when we are embedded within this, and our corporeality becomes incorporated and involved through this conditional extensionality, the pervasiveness of this automation demonstrates not that those animate machines are clearly separate from humans, but again, that the entanglements of mutual prostheticization. It is a prosthetic of us, we are prosthetic of it. We are the prosthesis in many terms. Between these operate in various kinds of diverse ratios, asymmetrically distributed agencies and counter agencies, right? It's all like when you are a prosthetic of the other and when we are prosthetics to each other is a kind of constantly transforming kind of structure. Now, as Chiara had mentioned yesterday, the position of the user within this, as we configured it within the theory of the stack, it may be sort of a way to sort of ground this, what occupies this position changes moment to moment. It can be singular, it can be amalgamated, it can be multiply incorporated, it can be pluralized. So the fact that we decided to hyper-individuate that user position is that the artificial decision to hyper-individuate that user position in and of itself is not something that is predicated on the necessity, technical or otherwise, of that position itself, but rather on a different earlier decision that is always something that can be remade. Now, for the lesson of the city, what's most important for the plan is then the difficult understanding of how our own physical embodiment and settlement making not only makes use of these automated prostheses, but that's what it is. City making is prosthetics design. City making is a form of prosthesis, and including the people that go there. We are the creature at the end of the tether. Now, this notion of the prosthetics and the relationship between the prosthetics and disability is what I want to speak about next. Instead of thinking about disability as a exceptional condition. One of the ways in which it's being re-theorized within disability studies is to understand it as a general disability is a kind of a general condition that operates across multiple spectra, that everybody and everything is disabled in these certain ways, and that there's differentially abled bodies that can interact with the built environment in across differential ways, rather than this binary of simply the normative abled body. In fact, the normative body would be, in this sense, the disabled body, which is us. I'm going to show you what I mean. So, here is the agent, Buzz Aldrin, the consummate executive agent, full, able mastery over the cosmos. He's enormous, as you can see, as he stands there next to the moon. Thanos scale Texans moving through space. So here's another picture of him. This image of in this case, an astronaut, could be a cosmonaut. China has a taikonaut. Black Sabbath has supernaut. We can interpret this image in at least a couple ways. Here is perhaps here is the figure of this master figure radiating agency, even as he, always he may appear, especially to himself, as this executive agent incarnate. But instead of the frontier puncturing space cowboy, we might see instead, and as we will obviously recommend, seeing instead a kind of a fragile animal floating in a shell, a pink putty sculpture, unable to leave his home without bringing an artificial atmosphere with it as it toddles slightly outward. It is tethered to multiple umbilical cords and re-encased in this inorganic placenta, without which it would instantly die. And hopefully, in a snap, we realize that this condition is not some extraordinary superhuman condition, but it's exactly the same as ours here on Earth, on the surface. We too would die without our automated life support systems. Agriculture, architecture, antibiotics. What at first glance looks autonomous, self-governing, set apart, able to decide on its own, is, upon closer inspection, always a condition decided in advance by those remote ancestral agents and relays, thus always automated as well. That includes not just the robot in the factory in Shenzhen, but also us. Now, as these artificial encasements, life support systems, are expanded in scale, the same premise roughly holds. This image from Lydia Kalapatides' Closed World, the index of a kind of quite interesting historical index and database of architectural projects that attempted to build completely self-sustaining closed worlds, closed loop systems, whether they are some weird hyper-sustainable house in Denmark or a moon base or Biosphere 2 or some combination of them as well. The subtitle of the book is Architectural Closure or the Power of Shit, because the question of waste always becomes the real sort of problem. Like, you can make absolutely everything and then it produces waste, and then what? And every sort of attempt to try to sort of reincorporate the waste back into the system itself eventually works for a little while, but it has these sort of reverberating permutations of various inefficiencies and external contaminations and so forth and so on. Very sort of quickly, one of the conclusions of the book that sort of draws hold that the projects that were much more successful were ones in which, instead of having these singular total little enclosures in which there was this total circular loop, you instead have ones in which there is a kind of network of relatively circular loops in which, in essence, as we said, the waste of one is the food of the other, right? Which sounds, it's better than it sounds. What? It doesn't have to be human centipede or any of the sort of things, rather than the sense in which that the cycle, that the process of internalization and externalization between sort of the sort of structural systems, that in essence, the mutualism, the symbiotic relationship between these kinds of the cellular inhabitant enclosures works better in which there is this sort of this exchange back and forth in sort of one way or another. These are artificial environments. There's artificial primordial inhabitations that would try to seek to hold, encase, grow, nurture, care for, tend to the growth of a precious organisms in their enclosure. And so the reference to the placenta earlier is, in a sense, not entirely metaphorical. A sort of extension of the thought here, we might think there's a relationship to some of the things we're talking about with Sloterdijk's notion of spheres, though we obviously are taking this in a quite different, far less Heideggerian sort of tradition. The idea that as we grow, each of us first in a womb, this enclosure, and we sort of build out, and ultimately, as we now find ourselves in the enclosure of the atmosphere, without which we would die, we're always dependent upon these enclosures within these various sorts of spheres. In thinking about the plasticity of those transformations and what the scope of artificiality of the tenderness and fragility of our conditional disability, and the condition of our life itself as something that is impossible without these extensional life support systems, which are themselves either living or not living. Both the reality and the conceptual construction of artificial wombs. This is a lamb that grew much of its what would have been its sort of pre-birth life in an artificial womb. Sometimes those boundaries introduce unexpected forms of interruptive violence. So watch out. So Helen Hester, who will be with you in a couple weeks, working around this as well. This question of she takes, I think, a complementary but sort of different take on this relationship between the ways in which feminist theory of technology has thought through the kind of mutualist imbrication of different forms of just the development of life and organic systems, but also with technical systems of both internal and external, and specifically the ways in which reproductive technologies need to be understood not as a kind of central question and concern of how we're even beginning to frame and ask that question, up to and including things like the artificial wombs. Now, scaling back a little bit from this as well, to taking an approach to this question of disability in a somewhat in a complementary but somewhat diagonal direction. There's ways in which that if we begin from the premise of the body in which we inhabit as fundamentally, in essence, it is like constantly in a process of dying unless it is plugged into the various internal and external life support systems, as we were talking about with the astronaut or the lamb in the artificial womb. There's also ways that as we meander throughout the world and making use of things, as we are organized and embedded and located within these cascades of various of automating systems, as we engage with prosthetics at the boundary of our bodies, or are engaged by those as made into prosthetics in those sort of ways as well. This is how our ability to actually move and act upon the world is made possible in the first place. And so a person who moves around the world in a wheelchair, for example, their ability to engage the world and to move with it and to make use of the interface and the access of the world is one that is basically dependent upon this more or less this more or less permanent sort of prostheticization of their body that transforms them into a quite different hybrid organism than any of us, in that, in a certain sense, like, for example, downhill, they have a different relationship to F equals ma than we might. But also in ways in which that, the form of this sort of prostheticization, that even that apparently what we might think of the conventionally disabled position would allow for even forms of activity that we are not able to, in fact, do, like the famous example of the South African runner who had the flipper feet things that could run, so, I'm talking about the Oscar, so he's got the artificial feet that allowed him to run the 100-yard dash or whatever faster than anyone else. And so the Olympic Committee was confronted with a very strange predicament, and like, we can't allow the disabled guy with no feet in the 100-yard dash because it would be unfair to the other people. Here, for example, is a monkey at a laboratory at Duke University that I met some years ago, who was part of a now discontinued brain-computer interface study. What this monkey was trained to do is that he has electrodes attached to, non-invasively attached to certain parts of his brain, the frontal cortex, in which he is able to concentrate and focus on the food object in this mechanical arm in front of him. And as you learn to focus and transform his, think about his thinking in such a way that this actually causes a physical transformation in the thinking material substrate, which his brain, that will send a different signal down the chain of communication, which makes the arm move towards his mouth, and he is able to eat the cookie in this way as well. This is also us. Perhaps this is social media in a different sort of way as well. But more importantly, then, I just want just sort of iterate the point in this. Well, if we begin with to this point of the plasticity of the human, if we begin from the starting point that the body is that disability is not an abnormal condition, but is right in a kind of a spectral, across multiple polychromatic spectra, is the basic condition of embodiment within the world, then the range of possibilities of embodiment is in fact reopened again in ways that are quite interesting, not in including the fact that it in principle would change some of the ways in which we understand what those who were normally identified as disabled are and mean. So this image here, I'll just tell you a little bit what we're looking at here. This is speaks a little bit about the ways in which I talked about it within the automation relay chains, how each of the entities in this also has a model of the entire relay, or it may have a model of the whole thing as it moves forward, and this affects how it chooses to act within this as well. That would be inclusive, I think, of the kind of intercorporeal body image that we have. You have a map of your own body within your body that allows you to, for example, close your eyes and walk across the room, because your proprioceptive you have a sense of your own displacement within space. So this is a sort of famous study of people with phantom limb, sort of a therapy for people with phantom limb syndrome. This fellow lost most of his right leg. Those of you, you're familiar with this thing, the phantom limb syndrome is a phenomenon by which you lose a limb, but you still can experience, in some cases, tremendous pain in the limb, because as you know, pain is in here. I mean, not, it's actually literally in your brain, like when you finger taps the table, the nerves are being attracted here, but the sense of that, like that the table is over there, is happening in here, several feet away, right? This is sort of thing. So there's a problem in essence with the way in which the body maps the body. Now, weirdly enough, and this is this V.I. Ramachandran, who's at UCSD, sort of innovated a lot of this sort of therapy. With this mirror box therapy, if you, for example, if it's your arm thing, if you put your arm to the mirror box such that what you're seeing is like your left arm being reflected as your right arm, in essence, it puts the arm, the amputated arm, back where it used to be. Now you might think like that's probably a dangerous thing to do with phantom limb syndrome, because that's going to trigger the phantom limb syndrome or something like this. Actually, what it ends up doing, weirdly enough, is it causes the brain to reorganize and remap itself in such a way that it no longer thinks it has an arm, because it's seeing, like, it actually sort of figures out that there's an illusion or something where no. But the ways in which I want to introduce this to the extent to which this question of the modeling and the prosthesis, the relationship between the model of the prosthesis and the prosthesis of the model sort of here as well, is not only one of a kind of mechanical attachment. It has everything to do as well as with the abstractions we have of and for those mechanical attachments. Now, this can go in lots of weird directions. I don't honestly know quite how I feel about this, but it seems like one of those sorts of, like, the speculative design projects that I like the most are the ones that the more you think about them, the less sure you are whether or not you think they're a good idea or not. If you know too quickly that this would be great or horrible, it's kind of not very interesting research. So this is a cafe in Japan. So this person, as you see here, is quadriplegic. They can't move their arms and legs, but their brain works perfectly well. And so a lot of people who are in this condition have these external interfaces where slight movements like eyeball directional movement and things like this allow them to manipulate graphical user interfaces so that they can communicate one or the other. So they're in this as well. And so what this scheme has in mind is this thing called this cafe that we wanted to visit when we were in Japan, but they were actually closed when we went there, sort of this time. Allows the person who's in the bed to manipulate the interface so that she's controlling the robot as the robot's moving through the city. So while she's lying there, she's seeing the movements of the robot through the city, who has a job at a cafe. So you go to the cafe, and all the waiters at the cafe are these robots. The robots come up to you, they hand you the menu. What do you want? I want a double espresso with the lemon, fine. And then the robot goes and gives the order. The robot's being entirely controlled by the person who is lying in bed. Now again, it's one of those things that's like either the greatest or the worst thing ever. I kind of like that it's a little of both. But what I'm trying to sort of suggest here a little bit is not, if it's not sort of clear enough, is that the positionality of this person in the bed driving this thing is in fact should not sort of be seen as exceptional, but in fact rather in a way much more sort of normative in relation to us. Like, we are them, they are us. We are as dependent upon these kinds of structures as well. It was a bit controversial within the disability community. There were lots of people who thought it was the most amazing thing, were super interested, and other people thought that it was not such a great idea. Again, I'm a bit, but I'm quite interested in it in the sense in which it kind of shifts this location of the normativity of disability and expands it in this way as well. So now, let me shift gears on this same topic a little bit here as well, of extending from this umbilical ecology and prefiguring a little bit one of the things that we'll be discussing tomorrow, which has to do with space and the ways in which the consideration, design, conceptualization of outer space, particularly the design of us and the design of the space in which we would be in the space, has had historically everything to do with the ways in which we've been able to divine and conceptualize planetarity itself. So put my cards on the table. One, I'm actually kind of sort of quite suspicious. I'm not particularly optimistic about at least the near-term viability of off-Earth civilizations. The Moon, maybe. Mars is quite difficult. Not that it's nothing really close. It's just that we're really not very good. We're not, like, of all the species on Earth that you would sort of take, we're like really needy and really fragile. We're very poorly suited to space travel. And we have to bring an entire artificial ecosystem with us. We can't, ultraviolet radiation, oxygen. It's like one thing after another. We have to bring a whole microbial biome with us, say sort of in the gut. We can't really leave Earth because, at the end of it, we can't leave Earth because even when we leave Earth, we have to bring an Earth with us everywhere we go, which is not the same thing, not quite the same for all Earthlings. And so I mentioned before the cosmonaut, astronauts, taikonauts, and the rest of this as well. One of the, I think another way of maybe thinking through the artificial composability of this condition of embodiment in relationship to that normative disability is through this suffix of not in perhaps in ways. And again, as I mentioned, there's one of our external members of the cohort, Rachel, is working on a lot of these, on different ways in which of prosthetic adaptations within space. One of the things in particular, which I'm sure we'll have her talk about here, in her talk, has to do with both the projects that have brought spiders into space, looking at the ways in which this affects the behavior of the spiders in space. We're talking about zero gravity web building is a whole thing. And they become, so when you bring them up, in short story, you bring them up there, they're very disoriented, they can't really do anything. They jump all weird, it takes them a long time to figure out again how to build the web, but pretty quickly they actually adapt to it and they start building different kinds of, the webs that don't look quite exactly the same, but they can do this and they make use of something. Then you bring them back down to Earth and they're helpless again. Like they can't jump, they can't do anything. It takes them a while to sort of readapt to the whole thing, but much quicker than we have. And some of our other work has to do with looking at some of these other strange NASA projects to use, in essence, what look like arachnid suits for kind of Dr. Octopus, I suppose, sort of arachnid suits for astronauts to move on low gravity surfaces because of you having the eight touch points. It actually sort of allows for greater maneuverability, I guess, in low gravity kind of environments out there as well. So all this stuff is great to start to think about. All right, last point on this thing, and then we'll cut this off. Extending this question of the spectrum of incorporation or amalgamation here as well. On the one hand, we've been spending a lot of time talking about how it is that we see these kinds of amalgamations between what would seem to be organic and inorganic life forms within these automated cascades, and it may seem as though the momentum is at each scale along the way. Pierce asked something about the kinds of scales of design, that all of the scales along the way are arcing towards a kind of entropic amalgamation of all of the things into some kind of last species soup-shaped thing. Not necessarily. It's simultaneous. One of the things that we were looking at in the last year, the New Normal program, and sort of carried over and sort of attempt to sort of do properly here going forward, is also the tendency that we see, particularly at urban scale, for not necessarily the total amalgamation of human-centric systems and technical-centric systems, but in fact they're more specific exclusion from one another, and the appearance of what what are called human exclusion zones, and the expansion and normalization of human exclusion zones at lots of different scales in the system, whether that is the parts of a factory where the humans are over here and the KUKA robots are over there, and they're kept separate behind cages so the humans don't get decapitated and the KUKAs don't get accidentally reprogrammed or something, all the way on to agricultural locations where you've got these highly automated food landscapes that are enormous, the size of cities in terms of their acreage, where no humans are essentially allowed to go. And then these kinds of things. This is a picture from the trip that the group went on last year to the Ural Mountains. It's a metal folding factory. Which kind of factory is it? They make pipes, right? And so it's a pipe factory instead of the Urals, and it's highly automated, and the floor of the factory is sort of automated. So like, there's no humans that are allowed on sort of the floor of this sort of whole thing. And so they decided to build this Zen rock garden on the floor of the automated factory, which struck me as sort of just like, yes, that's it, right there. That's what we do. That's what I meant. More of that, please. So when we're thinking about this question of the sort of the distinction, the separation, and amalgamation, it's not necessarily, we need to sort of clear that first of all, that it's not necessarily all about the amalgamation. That may in fact be this, a kind of more, that it sort of takes another step, that actually maybe one of the other implications of an understanding of the relationships and conditions and risks of the entanglements is that we actually design systems that are specifically disentangled from one another for specific purposes. And so this is how, in a way, I would want to position the half-Earth argument that Wilson makes, is that it's actually, the half-Earth argument needs to be considered as part of the spectrum of amalgamation to disamalgamation. It's not that, okay, we're going to reconsolidate and refortify culture behind a fence, and we'll have all the nature behind the other fence, and that we're going to sort of really, like, finally separate the oil and water here, and just keep them going, but rather that, like the human exclusion zones at the very, very small scale, that there becomes a deliberate and artificial decision that the preferred conditions of these different chemical assemblages is one that will essentially operate better if they are organized according to this territorial logic, which is to say, as I was saying before, is that you set aside half the Earth not because it's nature, but because it's not. And it's this equally sort of artificial gesture. And it's not because it then becomes, as was indicated before, I think you mentioned in terms of the fires in Australia, that it's therefore delinked from the rest of the planetary ecosystem, but rather there becomes the vast set aside because it is linked to the planetary ecosystem, and through its linkage, you ask it to do what it does by itself, and it will do it better, and it will be able to do it more if it's left alone. Last point, there's something on this question of some of these things in Russia. We had a couple interesting projects. It's obviously several interesting projects. Let's wrote two that may be sort of apropos to bring up here that have to do with some of these dynamics within Russia. One was called Land and Sky, or Earth and Sky. One was called Vault. Both of them were dealing with, one way or another, in different ways of understanding the history of Russia as a kind of terraforming project, beginning with the artificial city of St. Petersburg, to Stalin's great plan for the transformation of nature, the railroad systems, the distribution of artificial towns and cities, the whole construction. Like Russia was a project in some ways can be understood as, in that the deliberate and artificial transformation of the physical site of Russia produces the nation in this way. There then becomes a question about the history of this in terms of the extraction economies and whether or not, as we were talking about yesterday with Bataille and the general economy, whether or not, in a way, that project, which has, in greater or lesser degree, has been built upon the large-scale liberation of carbon and other elements along the table of elements, now needs another complementary phase in which that is, in a sense, closed, and that those things are put back again into something we might think of as a kind of vault. Okay, last point here. And then we promise last point here. So in addition to strategic exclusion, we should also concentrate and intensify. In exclusion, we then also are interested in this concentration and intensification of human-machinic amalgamation. It's a spectrum. So even as we manage what is outside of them according to their own absence. So among them, then the most central sort of design, economic and ecological design strategies has to do with the urban and regional scale and of zoning of different spaces of automation, amalgamation, and separation. Yes, this has to do with at the scale of the direct embodiment of the world, but it also has to do with operations at the scale of an entire landscape. The question and in this sense, this is where it comes back to the ecological question quite directly. And in this, there's ways in which it makes use of existing systems, previous patterns of urbanization, but also we anticipate that new kinds of niches will emerge and new kinds of adaptations will emerge. And as they do, a new kinds of semiotics within them, some of which may be utterly unavailable to us. Part of I think part of the approach to this is to understand is that, again, to this question of mastery, part of that general semiotics of that linking of the technical signaling and the biological signaling, we cannot and should not presume that all of that, we obviously can't presume that all of that signaling is for us, but we also can't presume that it will ever be legible to us, or that it ever should be legible to us, or that it should be, the criteria should be its legibility for us as well. The forms of signaling and semiotics that we are capable of comprehending, we should assume is always a tiny minority, a minor literature of all of the semiotics of the world. So for example, dark factories are factories in which, that are dark, in which complex manufacturing and assembly carries on in its loud, cacophonous clamor, but without illumination. This is actually a live feed from a dark factory in Shenzhen. I have the sound off, though. It operates in this huge loud, making sort of things without any illumination because robots don't need visible light in order to see and move and make things. So why would you turn the lights on for the robots? Because they don't have eyes. So it looks like this. So, to me, this underscores, I think, like how the ecological chain of automation depends on the particular adaptive forms of sensing and signaling that make sense according to the contextual demands of specific niches. And these chain reactions, including the closed loops, the dissipated waves, all depend on particular kinds of sensory mediation to sense and register or resist and deflect the forces of transformation they come in contact with. So this is in contrast then to that sort of earlier well-orchestrated Rube Goldberg machine that I showed you earlier, where in this sense the direction of force was linear. Part of what makes it kind of magical is the transference of momentum is in a linear direction. But it's not always this way. Even if it can be much more agnostic as to what kinds of things, how that momentum is transferred and what it occurs next. Clearly what I'm suggesting here is not only is that this is the way of the factory, but that as outside the factory walls, the same processes of trophic cascade are what we should be paying attention to. Trophic cascade, by the way, it's a term of ecological science which refers to when you add or subtract one element, let's say a species, from an ecosystem, it can have enormous indirect effects on other features and functions within that ecosystem. And you think of like the cascade of trophic reactions within this world. The famous example of this is how the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone changed the course of the river. You put wolves back into Yellowstone, they eat more deer and elk. There's less elk and deer to eat the grass on the side of the river. There's less grass on the side of the river changes direction. The reintroduction of wolves is how you change the direction of rivers. This is a trophic cascade. The automated systems in which we're embedded are also trophic cascades. They're not always the linear system of the Rube Goldberg machine. So, There are these indirect interactions by which the introduction or subtraction of one entity, for instance humans, has dramatic consequences up and down the relay chain, which can in turn we can alter an entire population and landscape. That is why the scope of the geopolitics that looks like a geotechnology and the geotechnology that looks like a geopolitics is the planning and governance of automated trophic cascades. That is what climate change mitigation looks like. So shall it be. So we have some time for some discussion before the time of the calories.
In fact, I'm not sure if it will be like questions / comments, but yep, toward to the beginning of the lecture.
Mm-hmm. Anything you like, yeah.
Okay, just we were discussing like the automation, the thing that was like where decision was already made.
Mm-hmm.
But if we are talking that this is a learning process, that means that it is kind of artificial intelligence here. So we have several iterations of this educational process where decision like repeat and each other. Mm-hmm. But in this way, how can we say that the decisions were already made if we have, say, like there are some cases as AlphaGo and Deep Blue,
yep,
when we cannot predict what will be in the end. And
right,
yep, there are still some questions.
So I'm not suggesting that automation and intelligence are the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that the kind of focused attention on this role of automation within the ecological cascade means that everything is decided and never needs to be decided again, or anything like this as well. As I said a few times, it's always about the system is always set in such a way that, at least in principle, that any of the nodes in this system are always available to redecision. And have to. The question is which ones and at what point in time, right? We don't want the question of what does red and green mean within traffic modulation to be open to a politicized renegotiation every time we sort of drive the car. But in principle, it can be. Okay. Now, but to the AI thing, what you're talking about there in terms of like, taking for example, like how deep learning systems learn to drive a car. There's a process by which it learns things. It's learning how to do something. And once it learns how to do something, in principle, it doesn't have to learn the same things always over and over again. It doesn't mean it stops learning, but it doesn't need to learn the things that it already knows. Right? And in fact, those abstractions have become technologies. And once they are technologies, they can be deployed without having to redecide that thing, which allows you to redecide other things, right? And so the deep learning systems learning how to drive a car, there's an interesting story here about how they do this. This is like the super fast version of this, but what used to be called good old-fashioned AI, GoFi, which was a kind of symbolic modeling, where we would figure out, okay, what is driving a car? Let's figure out what driving a car is. What are the rule sets of driving a car? Then we'll program this rule set into an AI. And then in principle, every time it comes into contact with a particular instance of this general solution space, it will apply the general solutions to the particular and figure out how to do it. This actually doesn't work really well. Mostly because we don't know how we drive cars. Like the way you think in terms of driving a car is not the way you actually drive a car. So it's like, in terms of the illegibility, like it's not just that we don't understand how the AIs think, we actually don't really understand how we think to the extent to which we can model and externalize it in this way. So, as you know, deep learning systems operate more upon just watching lots of people drive cars. And it will and it gets trained over and over and over and over again. And it will learn how to do this. Whether or not it's actually building something that we could identify as a representational model of its own processes is a matter of some debate. And there's also ways in which some will argue that now is the time to bring back in some of those symbolic reasoning processes so that it can make higher level abstractions over what it's learned. But the key point here is that in order for it to automate a decision that has been made, that decision has to be made at some point. In order for it to be made, there has to be learnings as to what to happen, and so your example of how AIs learn as a precondition for how what they've learned becomes codified, so that they can spend the time learning something else, if you like, is exactly the process that you're right, and I hope that's what I mean. Yeah.
On this matter on the infrastructure you said, maybe I did not quite understand the argument, but I think that on most occasions that infrastructure is considered to be depoliticizing, as you said, is not so much like the challenge is not so much on the automation of its parts and the automation of decision, but in the presumptions or let's say who has the position in this relay of sovereignty, right?
And who decides when something gets redecided?
Okay, yeah. So even if we have like the best operability of the system as our target, then maybe we have different priorities between different systems.
Yep.
So then again, we start having collisions, right? So then what like this matter of automation maybe is becoming a different matter, right? So what's that then? Like, is that then politics or?
Sure. No. I was saying that even the parts I was trying to offer even sort of a different version of this based on this idea of the geotechnology that looks like a geopolitics and the geopolitics that looks like a technology, to indicate that even those infrastructural systems, and maybe even especially the parts that are automated, in fact are highly political, and that the idea that the impetus to identify them as non-political, I would see motivated by the presumption that something that has been predecided that should not have been predecided, or something that should be opened again, and that is the politicization, which are quite clear. But that even the things that are automated, we should understand is like always available to the system. Now, I think what you're doing is you're basically taking this sort of model and saying, okay, let's put it to work and expand it. Not only we're talking about one system in a petri dish, but out in the wild, where you've got systems in contact with other systems in which they may operate in complementary or abrasive kind of conditions, and sometimes that sort of the grinding noise between systems can last a very long time, and may even become normalized within those systems, where like the presumption of that boundary becomes part of the kind of the hard shell of the system, or gets used in sort of ways. And so. I think what you're explaining here indicates yes, I think the ways in which the sort of systems operate in this sort of differential forms of relative complementarity or lack of complementarity is exactly the point of this as well. And so, if the next part of this is like who decides when in which the condition of the redecisions are made, sort of around this as well. Yes, exactly. I mean, I think this is I'm specifying the terms by which this discussion we had sort of long yesterday about the absent sovereign within this dynamic is made clear here in a certain sort of way as well. Now, I mean, we can identify that in real world systems, there's lots of different ways in which certain things get made and unmade at different points in times. But I did want to sort of emphasize this point, however, in contradistinction with the idea that once the decisions are automated, that means that they are depoliticized, and that means that they have what we might see as negative political effects. I wanted to offer a counter interpretation that was just that even this automation decision we should understand as a political process, and that many of the political effects of that standardization that we would understand as positive, because it allows for an open egalitarian access to the system, is so because it is standardized. And that is also part of its political valence. And so to politicize and to think about the political implications of that node in the system only in terms of its agonistic contestation would be a mistake. It has to also be turned in terms of its automation and standardization. Those are perhaps in many ways more efficacious.
But I think that then everybody agrees that, like the abstraction that when you open the faucet, then the water should be running. But then the question is, who has a faucet on their home? It's like,
Yeah.
it becomes this kind of question then.
This is a precedent. This is what I'm saying. It's like the deployment of that infrastructure may be based on. It's not that it has no decision. It's like but the decisions get made, and they get made in layers, and they get made anonymously. No, people forget where the decision. But in essence, once the decision is laid out, it no longer needs to be redecided in every instance. This is sort of what I meant to it. It doesn't mean that therefore that the decision was the right decision, but it does mean that in fact that the fact that it's there, or when it is there and it can be turned on and it just comes out, it means that we can think about something else.
And that's then why
when that is the case, yes.
we move the agency from the agents to the positions. Like, so where
That there's agents,
are,
well,
is what
there's
matters.
agency in theory, there's agency in principle in all of these positions. But I also would sort of add to this is that there's agency in the positions even when, and sometimes especially when, it's not reopening the agonistic decision. That in the consolidation and automation of the decision, that may have greater reverberation and effects that we might recognize as societal and political effects, even not even though it is standardized, because it is standardized. That is a form of agency too that is not predicated on this executive reevaluation, though that executive reevaluation is also a kind of form of agency.
Yeah, I kind of continue this question about the standardization and depoliticizing. So I was just thinking, if everything is standardized, like we as a human civilization standardize our life because we depend on very standardized shell to support our biological selves. What will happen to culture? Yes, that's like, how do you think this? Because
I'm not arguing. So I'm not arguing that the more things are standardized, the better the outcome of this. Well, I'm simply sort of making a much more conditional argument within this as well. Is that perhaps, I mean, the gist of your question sort of indicates in a way the logic of why I felt necessary to make the point. Like the idea that standardization means in essence, a closure, a sort of closing down of the possibility of a more spontaneous and heterogeneous access to the complexity of the lived shared world in and of itself a priori. I want to suggest, like, actually not necessarily, and that many of the things that we already sort of depend upon at an infrastructural level that would allow for that sort of improvisational navigability that can operate is actually dependent upon standardization of the key protocol points within that network itself. And so perhaps counterintuitively, not always, but many times, the standardization within the system is the thing that makes the system open and egalitarian itself. And so the example of TCP/IP, making anything that wants to connect to the internet, whether it's a citizen or not a citizen, whether it's a human or not a human, just as long as it works, as long as you operate according to this protocol, we don't care. It's an open suffrage, if you like, within this position because of the standardization. Is it possible to sort of understand, like, standardization can have this effects, and when we see this effects, it may be in fact be due to standardization, and conclude that not everything should be standardized? I think we can think both. I think these are both. I think these are both true.
I mean,
and it has to do with sort of the design of this relay. If everything in the relay is exactly the same, then there really isn't, there isn't the really capacity for transformation of anything through the relay.
Like in the context of climate change, how that would be, because this is like what we usually talk about, the resources that we can extract or can utilize, that usually they are like measured. This is how much, I don't know, CO2 emissions you can use, this is how far you can fly, or how much water you can consume, kind of this
budgets of sort.
Yes.
What is the question? Or what's the idea?
What I see in many those international political documents, they usually say like there is a quota per person, and this is what kind of alarms me. Like this is how far you can go using the planet or something like that.
I agree with you.
Yeah. So
I think taking what is quite clearly a planetary scale long-term transformation of and process of the, as we've been talking about, the headless geoengineering, the terraforming process of the last 25 years, and to what Pierce's point in terms of the Mark Fisher quote is like, it's precisely because it's anonymous and nameless and amorphous that it is what it is. There's an attempt, the response then, perhaps not surprisingly, is then to try to give it a name and give it a shape and give it a culpability, to give it a sort of things like, and in a culture in which culpability and identity and subjectivity and agency are sort of pervasively understood as in terms of the individuation of those things, that the specific individuals are as the unit of analysis by which those principles are possessed and have this agency. It's not surprising that what is well, obviously even bigger than an infrastructural condition gets personified into, where you put your garbage. Like you particularly, like all of the sort of process it essentially operates within these sort of cellular monads of these hyper-individuated eco-citizens. I agree with you that it's an utterly bizarre mismodeling of the problem, but one that's not so unexpected for a tribe such as ours that sees everything in the world as the accumulation of individual subjectivity and agency.
I wanted to talk a bit about the artificial indeterminate.
Yeah.
I think the part that is, I think, clear to me is this idea where you say that the plan basically, needs us to not subordinate one side of a simple equation to the determination of the other. This idea
simple equation, yeah.
Yeah, this idea that the plan, in the sense of its economics, its technology, its the technology, economics, and politics, that they can't be either like that we see the determination as another mirror of ourselves, nor as this foreign thing that we should be afraid of, that it needs to be somewhere in the middle, that we need to untangle this a bit. I understand that it's necessary for the plan. I'm kind of interested in whether you believe that is still also necessary as a sort of motivation that comes for those making the plan, in one sense us, but also others, where I think there is still a very essential role in a sort of belief in our own determinant hand within this.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about. That's what we were talking about yesterday in what we've been conjuring as this idea of the artificial, and trying to sort of own up to this first principle that the response to anthropogenic climate change needs to be equally anthropogenic.
Right.
And we're taking as the kind of an axiom for this plan itself. So it's not that there is no determination, but the determination is much more complex and distributed and operates in other sorts of ways, such that this simple equation of understanding technology is essentially a kind of haunted by the conditions of its social construction and ideological, or that society is entirely determined. So that this simple equation is not going to be very helpful in actually understanding what that conditions of artificiality and anthropogenesis is and means. So once again, in the logic of this Copernican trauma that we're talking about, and the shift away from the anthropocentric and anthropomorphic logics of this, it is not, the implication of this is not that therefore we have no agency or have no capacity for organizing the cascades of dominoes. but rather that we actually get a much clearer and more direct and disenchanted sense of exactly of the agency that we have had, but haven't been able to understand and conceptualize. And her comment about, and the certainly about the historical terraforming of the last 200 years as being this gigantic effect that we cannot understand how to conceptualize the agent of this effect is exactly what I'm talking about. The anthropogenesis of the terraforming we have done had a collective subject, if you like, and so that the conditions of this anthropogenic response in such a way is one that absolutely requires a re-understanding of what the basis of what the possibility of design and designation and who and what is doing that design would even be. So I quite agree, and again, I want to clarify this term specifically because so many of the other ways in which the notion of critiques of anthropocentrism and one way or another come to an immediate conclusion in a sense that means that we would or should withdraw agency from the world, and that is the sort of the proper response to this. And I'm trying to suggest, like, actually it's not.
Yeah, and then I guess there's just a slight warning in this of keeping that in mind to not like kind of go overboard in that, like just seeing another mirror. Like the part about
right. It's not that it looks like us. And that's what I'm saying. Right. We are in a way now finally able to actually act upon it properly because we are disabused of the illusion that it is a mirror.
Okay.
And therefore, potentially we have that the condition that agency is now finally possible. Yeah.
You talked about a network of automation, and you said that no relay has primary agency in that network.
Necessarily. No relay necessarily has primary agency. You of course can build a network in which one relay does have primary agency, but we shouldn't assume that all relays do. That's what I meant. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if that implied some kind of position on free will or determinism.
Yes.
Which is that?
I'm against it.
Hmm?
I'm against it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's a bigger question. No, I mean, is that what appears? That's what I'm saying is like what appears to be autonomous, self-governing, is actually more likely something that is the conditions of its decisions have been sort of laid out well in advance, so that the possibility of this decision is so over-determined that you can't really understand that decision when it happens as being something that is entirely self-governing or entirely free in this regard. Language speaks us as much as we speak language, I suppose might be another way of thinking about it. In this sense, you know. Yeah. So let me just explain. I'm not suggesting, therefore, that it's impossible for us to. That it's impossible for there to be some sort of unexpected or chaotic deviation. That we would make a decision to do something completely unexpected. I mean, in general, the thing that is most likely to happen next is usually the thing that doesn't happen next, even though that it's the most likely thing to happen next. For example. Right. All kinds of weirdness is not only possible, it's essentially sort of to be expected. But I guess what I'm saying is like the notion like therefore that kind of self-transparent executive decision function is by definition the first mover. And that first mover is by definition the thing that causes the relays. I think that's not the way it works. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that something like originality is impossible. That's not what I mean. Or that weirdness is the problem. That's not at all what I mean. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
Oh. Sorry.
Both same time. Both
Yeah.
just talk.
1, 2,
1,
3.
2, 3.
I want to shift back a little bit about this question of automation. And I think on a theoretical ground, we understand how relays can have different agencies. That the first one doesn't have the primary agency. But when we look at real automation processes, there are other fears. The fear is not that someone loses his job and cannot have the mastery of a machinery. The fear is that
it's not there, and they're not wrong. Yeah, and they're not wrong to be fearful.
But there are effects that are much scarier, like there are systems that lead to centralization. I mean, a typical example is moving from a coal distribution network to gas or oil distribution network, when there is no person who can make a decision, stop the system and say, oh, maybe we change the way, this is how we're gonna protest, this is how we're gonna stop the system and have a conversation about how our working conditions are being made. Mm-hmm. When a pipeline runs on its own, the ability to stop that is in the hands of a very top.
It's not in the hands of, they're not even able to stop it. The idea that, again, the idea that somewhere like there's Mr. Oil who could, like, is sitting in front of a button that could hit stop, and if we just convince him, or if we just get someone else in that chair, that action could take place. This is also part of the first mover illusion as well.
But actually,
but you're absolutely right.
Oil embargoing by the Gulf state, that was that. The oil embargo was a lot of that oil guys sitting and saying, we're not going to sell oil. And it was, at some respect, stopped the flow. It had
that's true.
In US.
So yeah, so quite clearly, again, I feel like I've said this a few times, because we can't understand these relays entirely we can't understand this. It would be a mistake to try to understand these relays in terms of that they are the subjective expression of the intentions of first movers within the system, that they in fact are doing lots and lots of other things, does not mean that there is no effective capacity to innovate, transform, block, resist, or structure that entire apparatus anywhere within the system. There's lots of those points. Some of them are, in essence, pre-decided. Some of them are always open to decision, and sometimes there's even weird examples like a conference in Switzerland that some people from OPEC countries come in and they all decide that they're going to turn off the spigot. This happens. This is possible. Right? This is well. But to identify the sort of the questions and to define these relays entirely in terms of these subjective, objective decisions, I think is it would be a mistake. But I do agree with you that once you've got these massive infrastructural systems set up in one way or another, that it's much, much harder to undecide them, for sure. Like what, and this is, and this is exactly part of the question that we've been getting at yesterday in relationship to, we've got the means, we've got the financial means, we've got the technical means, we don't have the mechanisms to undecide some of these things, and that, which is what we need. We need to redecide, in essence, how these energy infrastructures play out, how they get used, and how they unfold in one way or another. So that's for sure.
I think it's also like a big part of it is saying how democratized the ability to undecide is.
Possibly.
Who has the right to undecide?
Possibly, but again, this goes back to the issue of the agonistic contestation of each of these nodes. It is absolutely true that in many circumstances, in very important ways, when there is a relay point or something within the system that has been, in essence, decided and automated, exactly what we have been talking about here is that the solidity and weight and intractability of not only that node, but perhaps the whole relay makes it very, very difficult to undecide which can have clear and obviously pernicious societal and political effects, and that the politicization is in demand for the reopening and redeciding of this node. There's no argument on this sort of the point. And also, at the same time, when it is also true that in perhaps the same a different point within the same relay or within a different relay as well, that the fact that a node is not being redecided, the fact that that node is fixed and standardized, is the thing that the standardization that can and does produce the positive political effects that we might be interested in as well. so as to define the politicization of these relays only in terms of agonistic contestation would be a mistake. That's sort of the point. It's not one or the other. It's not one or the other by any sort of stretch, by any kind of stretch. Yeah. But please
go. It's the in-between point where it is scary. What is problematic is when the system is optimized enough to operate like the traffic light. None of us would ever think to politicize it, to say that we need to change it.
I bet I'll find you somebody. who will argue? Who
I'm
will?
Sure you can have some Twitter accounts there.
No, it's just that our small town was much better before we got the traffic light and blah blah blah. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which you can, people can be not like traffic lights. Anyway.
Yes. Thank you.
No. I thought you were about to sort of. I want to make sure your point is quite important to clarify. So I want to make sure that we do so.
I think my really sort of condition is not so much about reaching the traffic light condition, is how can we take this very complex, very politicized systems and reach to the condition of a traffic light when they're optimized to a level that no individual or no entity, no node can unnecessarily interrupt it.
Exactly. That's the T-shirt. Long T-shirt. But yes, that's it. That's just the sort of thing. This is the question. It goes to something that he was indicating yesterday about the Hegel version of Google. Or maybe it's sort of parts of this as well. I don't think there's ever a point. I don't think we've ever reached a point in which we just build the perfect machine, and we set it on Go, and then we can just go fishing, something like this, right? I think there's, and I don't know that this is necessarily has to be sort of the goal sort of here as well. I think, however, to the question of how it is that we can design and conjure and specify that geotechnology that looks like a geopolitics and the geopolitics that looks like a technology will require, as a sort of first principle, an understanding of this relationship between how it is that the particular nodes in the system might be decided and pre-decided and automated. It's a kind of basics. I'm sort of trying to say, sort of imagining this as sort of more like a kind of fundamental syntax by which these things might sort of be developed. And again, it's not that once, and the other thing is that once it's decided, once it's structured, that means it's in its most good state. I don't think so. I think that also means that it's also in a state where it can be more difficult to undecide. It's one in which it might be quite difficult to adapt to any kind of circumstance. I mean, any kind of total design, like the old 60s Reiner Banham, the megastructures that Reiner Banham criticized, they were these total absolute environments, a place for everything in their place. They're incredibly fragile. As soon as the ants and cockroaches got in, Biosphere 2, it was cannibalism. Right? Tiny little things have this giant sort of reverberating effect. Unless the mechanism can actually adapt and respond and replace itself and sort of mutate in the rest of this as well, then it's a catastrophe. And I think that is kind of what we have with the oil lock-in. We're all locked into oil. Everything. It's a very difficult thing to undecide.
So earlier you were talking about where wolves were introduced in the national park, and the course of the river got changed in the process.
In Yellowstone, right, yeah.
And here it says, put directly, the scope of the geopolitics that looks like a geotechnology and geotechnology that looks like geopolitics is the planning and governance of automated traffic cascades.
Right, like the wolf.
Yes, exactly. This is what climate change mitigation looks like?
Well said.
Yeah. So because I don't really think they knew that the river course is going to be changed before the wolves were introduced.
They had some idea, but
yeah.
But you're right. I mean, this is the principle comes from the sort of nascent of ecological science. You're absolutely right. Our comprehension of how it is all this stuff works, and if you pull on one lever, what's going to happen on the other side is obviously we're nowhere near any kind of engineering-like mastery of the whole thing. I don't know. We never will be, and I don't know that we necessarily need to, in order to set more wolves free. I think there's ways in which you can understand the premise, that you can understand you can understand trophic cascades at a level of a kind of tactical knowledge. You don't need to understand inorganic chemistry and molecular bonding to build a bridge. You can put things together in such a way that it'll have sort of effects, and regardless of a sort of full stack and full scale mastery of the system.
That's like a more experimental measure, if I would say so.
It is, but it's also like, again, I don't think that's something new. I think kind of what we've been doing that all along. The point is that's the way it works, right? Instead of thinking about these systems as these nice, neat, linear Rube Goldberg kinds of things, where you've got this clear linear. That's like the car commercial thing I showed you, like these sort of linear sort of transformation of energy, or which are like assembly lines. We should presume like the relays that we're talking about are ones that are more like the trophic cascades. So it's the abstraction, the abstraction that we have about these relays should use those as as the model for how in which they would work. Yeah. And so you're absolutely right. There's a huge degree of risk and uncertainty and indeterminacy in the system. That's just the way it is.
So to that effect, maybe, so we are also talking about half Earth, where we segregate like two halves, one to repair the planet and the other for humans.
Yeah, I mean, which can mean a lot of different things, but the premise would be that you have some kind of intensification of the efficiencies of the basic functions of human civilization, of food and water and air. So that might be much more highly technologized. So we live inside the automated machine, which we call a city, and everything else is
left to its own devices. I wanted to say, instead of going for exclusion, we might go also with something like sentient inclusion, where maybe cyborg becomes like a new normal sometime in the future.
No, it's been a new normal for 30,000 years.
But it's not very popular as such right now. And
that idea, or the
not the idea, as in a real.
No, it's so. Come on, you've got.
Yes, exactly.
You've got maybe this is you got more brain in your hand than you do in your skull.
But like.
It's not a new thing. This is old.
But like when we are making all these systems, we also kind of think of biospheric surveillance of sorts, because in order to monitor
which is what we're gonna go deeper into this afternoon. Right.
So it seems like, since it's kind of weird, but still. Sentient inclusion might be a better option, because we humans interact with each other, but at the very core we are also very automated on the basis of our context, whatever we have gone through in the past, our experiences, our learning. So in a way we are also like machines.
Yes.
And if machines cannot make a decision because they have been pre-designed, they are following some code, and so are we. In a way, but we have found some way to overcome our barriers, and maybe we can teach the machine somehow how to do the same thing.
Maybe I don't want to stop you. So you go with it.
Inclusion, maybe then we don't have to divide things. We just have to make a machine which understands everything. Not understand, at least recognize new things and.
Yeah, right. So forms of artificial intelligence that would be embodied in the world in certain ways. I mean, I think part of the idea of AI is this sort of Cartesian brain in a petri dish that isn't embodied in the world is the wrong starting point. It is more like the driverless car kind of thing. It's physically in the world in a certain sort of way, and as there's different way, it doesn't think the same way we think. The goal of AI should not be to make it think like primates think. It's made out of rocks. It's going to think differently than we do, and that's okay. But if it is better able to not just execute procedurality in these sort of structures, but it actually has the capacity for better degrees of dealing with indeterminate and amorphous and unstructured conditions, then it may look more like our heuristic functions, where we understand a solution from one space and we're good at moving it into another. That's the thing we're really good at that AI is not, right? The joke of AI is like, AI is the thing that can beat you at chess when the room's on fire. We can learn how to fix a car and then therefore get better at cooking dinner. You can move the heuristic kind of tactical understanding from one thing to another domain. We can abstract these things. This is the abstraction that we're talking about, within this well, and that form of that capacity for abstraction, sort of thinking about, and producing models that are predictive, models that are hypothetical, models that are strategic. This is part of our pattern finding and capacity for adaptation. So we are quite good at those kinds of things, and hooray for us.
I mean, for now, because like we have not created a machine that's better.
Well, we have in different ways. It's just not. It doesn't work in different ways. I mean, it's better. We've made machines that are better than us at very specific things for a really, really long time. It just depends on. But the problem is that they, in many cases, or not the problem, but the thing is that they oftentimes are not very good at other things at the same time. But they don't need to be, right? You know, trees don't need to be rivers, and rivers don't need to be rocks. They can just be what they are. A bridge doesn't have to be a wheel. A wheel doesn't have to be a cup. They can just be what they are. Yeah.
Just one question.
Yep.
Well, there are two actually, but I will start following, I think, the one that George did at the beginning, which is linked or related to automation as a tool of dispoliticization. I mean, if the first step that deploy an automated system were made under a specific sociopolitical paradigm, then it seems to me that all the subsequent relays will be linked to this sociopolitical interaction, even if 99% of the population thinks that is actually like a positive direction. So in some way, my question will be like, could automation become more than a tool of this politicization, a perpetuating tool of political intention?
Yes. So two things. One, we're trying to abstract the notion of automation into a much bigger general principle than the specific, more local forms of ways in which people get replaced by machines on assembly lines or truckers get replaced by machines. Like these are contemporary local instances of a much larger phenomenon, and essentially that one of the things that the sort of clear emergence of these processes really since the beginning of the middle of the 20th century has begun to make clear is that automation, what we're calling automation, has always actually been part of the way in which this sort of world works. So we could, if you want to, you can make a kind of conceptual distinction between this sort of local and general forms of automation, right? And so there's a local form of automation where the workers used to be organized this way. Now the workers are being organized that way. And in this instance, there may be all kinds of things to be promoted or resisted or remade or sort of removed. But what I've been sort of putting forward is more this is what these sort of fictions revealed and what this general process of automation, in fact, would look like, and how we could use it to even to develop a different vocabulary by which that reorganization in the local sense might actually be defined and take place. How do we define this problem space? And I would define it quite differently than what you offered, in that the idea that any of these deployments of these kinds of systems is really just an instantiation of of what you call the socio-political systemic circuit. Yeah, is kind of, I mean, in a way, we will have to talk a little bit more how to sort of mean this, but there's a version of this that's sort of quite much of like the social determinism sort of model that I was trying to sort of unfold. That this technology at the end of the day really is just a reflection of our way of, a reflection of our own social relations. That it is really just us.
So in some ways impossible to, this politicized. Like we are always political in some way.
Huh?
We as humans, we are always political. Every decision we make is going always to be political.
If you like. But it's also in the system. But where we may sort of agree is that it's not that the technology is an expression or reflection of a sociological condition, and that we can in one way that we might want to refuse or resist or understand this technology precisely because it is invariably and permanently haunted by this original reflective sort of organization, rather than we want to understand the system itself, both the parts that are open to variation and the parts that are already automated, decided as itself the physical instantiation of the political. The political as a non-discursive operation, the political as the externalization or just the distribution, let's say, not the externalization, but the distribution of decision within the landscape, not the externalization of our social form in sort of the sociomorphic projection. So the idea of something is sort of like this technology was begat by some historical moment of original violence, for example, and therefore it is forever haunted by this moment, and that its futurity is already overdetermined and predetermined by this historical original sin going forward. It is exactly the kind of sociomorphic projection that I'm cautioning us against. It's why we can't actually figure out and position the agency and sovereignty and recomposability of the system that we actually need. It's the problem, not the solution.
And also, I understand that automation in some ways like a basic system by which many natural ecosystem works.
Yeah,
so
I'm being a bit, so what I'm trying to offer is roughly that, this example of the wolves in Yellowstone, it's like, I'm saying like, that's not an allegory for automation, that is automation. Yes, and that the versions of that we're building inside of factories is not an allegory for those ones, it's simply a different version of a process that's actually quite similar.
Yeah, so in some
that's,
way,
okay? Yeah.
we call like artificial automation, like a nature-based solution in some way.
If you like, but I wouldn't, because I wouldn't think that as we were talking about yesterday, the appeal to nature as a starting point has all kinds of problems. That the idea that the opposite of that the natural is the opposite of the artificial.
Yeah, you're keeping the dichotomy between both.
No, I'm not keeping the dichotomy.
No, if you have if I have like this perception between artificial automation and natural automation, I'm keeping some way the concept.
Right, and that can cut both ways. I mean, you could say that. I mean, one way in which that the appeal to nature has operated is that it becomes a basis of a kind of an unearned legitimation. That's like, oh, we're going to organize things this way because it's natural. It's like that's the way it happens in nature, and so because it happens in nature that way, this highly contingent, arbitrary set of circumstances it's like you have to sit down and be quiet because that's just the way it sort of this operates in nature, and this is sort of the other side of this. This is something we would be equally suspicious of. Yeah.
About the human-centered design, back to Earth. Just that, as a service designer, I have quite a trauma about this subject and about all the design thinking and the basics of it. So as much
We're
as
here for you.
Huh?
We're here for you.
As much as I dedicate a lot of time also saying we have to go beyond human-centered and so on, thinking of it a lot, actually what I came to is exactly that we have never been human-centered. That's the problem. Like the 95% of the issue is that we're like focusing on this moment of this, I don't know, spectral consumer persona and not really the full human. And that's the big issue, because you are not, if you think about the human, you need to think that human needs a clean air, human needs the ecology, ecosystem, human needs the relationship which go beyond the social media and so on and so forth. And that's the huge issue that, first of all, we never reach the human-centered because probably exactly we don't know exactly what is human, like the perception of exactly that Vitruvian man, individual, which is
psychologized, utilitarian, button pushing.
It's really not what human is, and that's the core of the issue, that when you do that for real and you like focus on the real position of the human, that probably the design would not be that different from the planet-centered or thing-centered. And exactly, and that at that point, the issue is not about taking human away, but taking also the idea of the center away. So exactly the Copernican turn would be decentralizing, disorienting, and just, you know, embracing the mess of the design without the center. And also, that's our limit then of the human design, because we want to always find this regularity and center and some simple order, but then it's probably impossible. That's more of a comment, obviously, not a question.
No, if this would be a much better version of the human-centered design that we would sort of have. I think one of the things, I think maybe another way in which I would maybe qualify this from my perspective might have to do also that instead of only thinking of this design as like the human is this already is invariant, like it's already a thing that I mean, not even speaking to the issues, like not all humans have the same design needs, and so this consolidation of humans into a singularized into this sort of structure has its own sort of issues. But I understand that you're already sort of understand this, but that instead of thinking of the human as a thing that's already made, and now we make the designs for this accommodation of this already understood thing, one of the key points of the Wigley and Colomina book is that it's the human is actually the thing that is being redesigned.
Yeah, that was my second question.
By the design. And if we take this as the sort of starting point, which I think is much closer to what I was trying to sort of hint at with the not suffix and the conditional disability and the extension mill and the mutual prostheticization, that the inclusion of the human, based on a much more direct and clear understanding of what boundaries and plasticity actually are, the human would very much be part of the system, but to your point, it's just not a kind of like fixed control variable radiating agency, you know, like Vitruvian man, which then gets sort of redefined as this homo button pusher kind of creature.
And that's the question exactly as you propose. You didn't say that today, but in the book there is that we need to design the human, which is quite different from designing the user as it was in the stack. And there is always this ethical issue about that. Exactly when we start, like there was a perfect thesis by.
But let me clear. I wasn't saying now we need to start designing the human like some sort of transhumanist thing.
No, exactly.
It's more like that's what we've been doing all along. Humans always has been this process of remaking itself all along. The human is an unfinished thing. It's always been like
but
that.
That's
not
kind of,
it's a new not that's the new deal.
That's kind of easy when we have the disguise of the artifacts that we're designing, and so everyone is like, yeah, I'm designing the product, I'm designing the building. And when you go to the service design and suddenly people say that, you're designing human behavior, and then there's all the ethical alarms just ringing and saying that, okay, something is not going well here, like we're going back to the social engineering, all the eugenics and all these issues.
That's a bit of a leap.
Yeah,
there's a bit of a leap
but
for
still there is quite
we want people to go over to the left so they will find their chair more easily.
No, still,
and
exactly.
We want them to understand what they can order. That's not quite the same thing as eugenics, but.
No, for sure, but still, when we take away the medium of design and some kind of mediation between designer and the human.
I don't think it should be. I don't think it has to be understood at all. I think the fact that the options we might think about this is in either it's what you invoked as a sort of eugenic social engineering behavior sort of model, or sort of versions of the human user as free will, individuated free will agent, and therefore the job of design is to deduce, intuit, and accommodate the maximal exploration and expression of the externalized desire of that individual sort of human. That's also a form of social engineering in a certain sort of sense, but it's also, it may be like why we've, after the years of presuming that that's in fact much more reasonable than it actually is,
and that
than doing anything.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, it would suggest both that we've been designing behavior all along. That's kind of how it goes. I mean, designing a chair is already designing organizing a room with chairs as opposed to benches is already a process of individuating the. You get my point around this.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
then it comes to the canine intelligence and all the ethical issues behind that. And how can we act in a way that we guarantee the positive results, and not become too like.
You can't. You can't. No. Yeah. It's. Sometimes the wolves move the river one way, and sometimes they move it the other way around the city. But I think the idea that somehow introducing the idea that that it's a designation of the design of process rather the design in those processes might be both material and immaterial that service design is sort of interested in. It is in a way, I think is maybe in some ways just a sort of more direct understanding of the design space that design has always been working with, but has been doing so through kind of foggy lenses. And so that it's always been designing behavior in one way or another. It's just perhaps been doing badly because it refuses to acknowledge that it's doing it at all. What?
We will try to do better.
Thank you.
When I imagine cascades of automated assemblages of human and non-human, I think that non-human can also have an agency on the cascade.
Of course.
How humanity can deal with it, because we haven't dealt with it. We haven't dealt with like requirements of like mammals or insects or animals.
Yes.
I mean, we haven't felt them.
I agree.
Second question is thinking about the design. So, does that mean that designer's role is to be a design of the assemblages, not the like user-centered design, like human-centered?
Right. And not only assemblage as a noun, but also I think to the point of the proceduralities as a verb, too. Yes. Right. As in designation, right? As in sort of this sort of structuring and motion. We develop this abstraction of what would be the form the assemblage might take. What are the hypothetical forms of this assemblage which we might do? How it is that we could structure that relay so that the outcome would resemble that hypothetical. This is the designation that we're talking about, right? So both the assemblage is the noun and the verb. Yeah. Still got another 3 hours in the afternoon. Do you want to get some lunch? Okay. No? Okay.
Maybe one last question and we can break for.
Okay, I have a question is about, do you think the technology and the abstraction cycle will somehow cause the failure in automation? Because I'm asking this because I'm experienced this coronavirus thing, which is probably...
Thanks for letting us know.
What?
No, I was making a dumb joke.
Yeah, it's probably a deliberately designed kind of insertion into, like from animal into a human DNA kind of thing. And then, yes, that's a speculation, and that's quite evident as well. And
I'm not sure I follow what you're suggesting. No.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, anyway, it now leads to what we see, we used to see China as a place that has already got some sort of stack that functions quite well. It's quite automated. I mean, it's quite highly automated.
But it's not super adaptive, right? It's kind of it's fragile.
Yeah,
its rigidity.
It
makes it quite difficult to adapt, and it's fragile in this regard. Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just that. I mean, how do you think? Well, maybe how do you think? Like, what could we like? How do we face this kind of fragile kind of?
It's a weird. It's a weird. Yeah. I mean, it's a. We can speak of this in more general principles, and then it becomes a kind of specific thing. But part of what he and I were suggesting here as well is that for the system as a whole, whether it's one specific relay or the sort of the agglomeration of all of these into a kind of meta enclosure of multiple sort of sub-component systems, that we know a lot of things about whether in terms of human organizations, biological systems, technical systems, of how it is that an inability for, like, as the system becomes more complex, it becomes it becomes in certain ways more vulnerable, that there is a sort of eruptive transformation at one point. It can in fact reverberate and have catastrophic failure, like the Space Shuttle Challenger, one little rubber ring explode and the entire spaceship blows up because of this, the integration of sort of things as well. So that in general principles, how do you conceptualize these and develop them in such a way that it both has the functions to where in the right places and at the right times, those nodes are in fact pre-decided so that it can have those subsequent generative effects that allow it for it to be open and predictable and egalitarian. And how do you design, whether it's the same one or a different one, that is open to revision and redecision in such a way that the entire system can actually be in a process of continuous adaptation so that it doesn't in fact have these catastrophic structures. I mean, it's an old problem. And it's one that's been sort of conceptualized by complex adaptive systems theory, management theory, within, in ecological science, a lot of different sorts of ways. And so you're right that this is again, I agree with you that is this not a fundamental question for this? Yes, I agree. Yeah. But everybody knows the virus is from outer space. It's not from. The virus is from outer space. Yeah, it landed at a meteor. Yeah.
I mean, I think because what we were talking about is that the abstraction that was caused by technology will, I think, a problem. Yeah.
The abstractions caused by technology will become a problem? I'm not sure. Most of the ways, I mean, in the ways I've tried to present it, the abstractions caused by technology is like that represents most of our thinking.
I was thinking about this abstraction, like, for example, what we call the smart thing, like the smartness. I mean, when we perceive this thing as a smart system, then we kind of forget that it's a lot of decision making.
Exactly. No, exactly right. This is a sort of, I mean, the ways in which that this is. I mean, on the sort of the point. I mean, in the sort of simplest sense, so much of the smart city discourse, and I hope that it's sort of clear the way in which we're talking about automation is quite far away from this, is one in which there is this extremely simplistic, reductive understanding of what a city is and what a city does, and a set of tools and mechanisms that's available to, in certain sense, try to optimize the city as this fixed thing. But in many respects, quite clearly is operating in another way in which there's a set of tools that is then modeling the city in relationship to the affordances of those tools and not the other way around. Right? And so you have a mechanism for control, we'll fit reality to fit the mechanism. And when it doesn't work, we'll push reality into it until it doesn't sort of work. This is, I think we're in agreement on this, and quite clearly also part of the ways in which many of these kinds of processes are sort of inevitably will produce their own kinds of sorts of accidents has to do with the misdirection of this, reduction, but also because it's the model of the city itself is not only simplistic and reductive, it's also far too static, right? That the principle that if we can pre-decide as many things as possible, then this will be more better as the basis of the standard off-the-shelf smart city suite of solutions from Cisco or Samsung or Alibaba or whoever. In many cases means that all of those things are unable to be redecided, unable to adapt, unable to actually evolve in certain ways as well. And so the trick is, on the one hand, how do you understand cities as real ecologies, as this process of relays within cities is already sort of a form of adaptation. Understand that the embedding of algorithmic intelligence in one way or another into these processes in a more deliberate artificial way is part of the design problem, but to do so in ways in which the control mechanisms that we heard about last night are ones that are, instead of reducing the reality to the scope of the abstraction, that the relation of the abstraction to the resolution of reality is actually one that is more viable and perturbable. Yeah.